Chapter 20. Beechy Island. June 25. The Forward sighted Cape Dundas, at the northwest extremity of Prince of Wales Land. There they found more serious difficulties amid thicker ice. The channel here grows narrower, and the line of Crozier, Young, Day, and Lowther Islands ranged in a line, like forts in a harbour, drive the ice streams nearer together. What would otherwise have taken the brig a day now detained her from June 25 to the end of the month. She was continually obliged to stop, to retreat, and to wait for a favourable chance to reach Beechy Island. Meanwhile a great deal of coal was consumed, though during the frequent halts only small fires were kept burning, sufficient to keep steam up day and night. Hatteras knew as well as Shandon the reduced state of their supply, but feeling sure that he would find fuel at Beechy Island, he did not wish to lose a minute for the sake of economy. He had been very much delayed by running south, and, although he had taken the precaution of leaving England in April, he now found himself no farther advanced than previous expeditions had been at that time of year. The 30th they passed Cape Walker at the northeast extremity of Prince of Wales Land. This is the farthest point seen by Kennedy and Bellot, May 3d, 1852, after an expedition across North Somerset. In 1851, Captain Amaney of the Austin expedition had been fortunate enough to get fresh supplies there for his detachment. This cape, which is very lofty, is remarkable for its reddish-brown colour. In clear weather one can see as far as the entrance of Wellington Channel. Towards evening they saw Cape Bellot, separated from Cape Walker by Macleon's Bay. Cape Bellot was so named in presence of that young French officer to whom the English expedition gave 3 cheers. At this place the coast consists of a yellowish limestone, very rough in appearance. It is protected by huge masses of ice which the north wind collects there in the most imposing way. It was soon no longer to be seen from the forward's deck, as she was making her way amid the loose ice towards Beechy Island through Barrow Strait. Hatteras, having resolved to go on in a straight line, in order not to be carried past the island, hardly left the deck during the subsequent days. He would go aloft to the crosstrees in order to pick out the most favourable path for the brig. All that skill, coolness, boldness, and even maritime genius could do, was done by him while sailing through the strait. It is true that fortune did not favour him, for at that season he ought to have found the sea nearly open. But by dint of sparing neither steam, his men, nor himself, he succeeded in his aim. July 3d, at 11 o'clock in the morning, the ice master saw land to the north. Hatteras soon made it out as Beechy Island, the general rendezvous for Arctic explorers. Almost all the ships which sail in these latitudes touch here. Here Franklin passed his first winter before advancing into Wellington Channel. Here Creswell, McClure's lieutenant, after a march of 460 miles on the ice, rejoined the Phoenix and returned to England. The last ship which anchored at Beechy Island before the Forward was the Fox. McClintock took in supplies there, August 11, 1855, and repaired the dwellings and storehouses. That was but a short time previous. Hatteras knew all these details. The boatswain's heart beat strongly at the sight of this island. When he had last seen it he had been quartermaster on the Phoenix. Hatteras asked him about the coast, the place for anchoring, the possible change of the bottom. The weather was perfect, the thermometer marked 57 degrees. "Well, Johnson," said the captain, "do you recognize this place?" "Yes, Captain, it's Beechy Island. Only we ought to bear a little farther north, the coast is more easily approached there." "But the buildings, the stores," said Hatteras. "Oh, you can't see them till you get ashore, they are hidden behind those hillocks you see there." "And did you carry large supplies there?" "Yes, they were large. The Admiralty sent us here in 1853, under the command of Captain Inglefield, with the steamer Phoenix and a transport, the Breadalbane, loaded with supplies. We carried enough to revictual a whole expedition." "But did not the commander of the Fox take a great deal away in 1855, said Hatteras. "Oh, don't be anxious, Captain," answered Johnson, "there will be enough left for you. The cold keeps everything wonderfully, and we shall find everything as fresh and in as good condition as on the first day." "I'm not so anxious about the provisions," answered Hatteras. "I have enough for several years. What I stand in need of is coal." "Well, Captain, we left more than 1,000 tons there, so you can feel easy about that." "Let us stand nearer," resumed Hatteras, who, glass in hand, kept examining the shore. "You see that point," said Johnson. "When we've doubled it, we shall be near our anchorage." "Yes, it's from there we started for England with Lieutenant Creswell and 12 sick men of the Investigator. But if we were fortunate enough to be of service to Captain McClure's lieutenant, Bellot, the officer who accompanied us on the Phoenix, never saw his home again." "Ah, that's a sad memory." "But, Captain, I think it's here we ought to anchor." "Very well," answered Hatteras. And he gave the proper orders. The Forward lay in a little harbour sheltered from the north, east, and south winds, about a cable length from the shore. "Mr. Wall," said Hatteras, "you will lower the launch and send 6 men to bring coal aboard." "Yes, sir," answered Wall. "I am going ashore in the gig with the doctor and the boatswain, Mr. Shandon. Will you go with us?" "At your orders," answered Shandon. A few minutes later the doctor, with gun and baskets for any specimens he might find, took his place in the gig with his companions. 10 minutes later they stepped out on a low, rocky shore. "Lead the way, Johnson," said Hatteras. "Do you remember it?" "Perfectly, Captain, only here is a monument which I did not expect to find here." "That," shouted the doctor, "I know what it is. Let's go look at it. It will tell us of itself why it was put here." The 4 men went up to it, and the doctor, baring his head, said, "This, my friends, is a monument raised to the memory of Franklin and his companions." In fact, Lady Franklin having, in 1855, sent a tablet of black marble to Dr. Kane, gave another in 1858 to McClintock to be placed on Beechey Island. McClintock discharged his duty and placed this tablet near a funeral pile raised to the memory of Bellot by Sir John Barrow. This tablet bore the following inscription: "To the memory of Franklin, Crozier, Fitzjames, and all their gallant brother officers and faithful companions, who have suffered and perished in the cause of science and the service of their country." This tablet is erected near the spot where they passed their first Arctic winter, and whence they issued forth to conquer difficulties or to die. It commemorates the grief of their admiring countrymen and friends, and the anguish, subdued by faith, of her who has lost, in the heroic leader of the expedition, the most devoted and affectionate of husbands. And so he bringeth them unto the haven where they would be. 1855. This stone, on a lonely shore of these remote regions, touched every one's heart. The doctor felt the tears rising in his eyes. On the very spot whence Franklin and his men sailed, full of hope and strength, there was now merely a slab of marble to commemorate them, and in spite of this solemn warning of fate, the Forward was about to follow the path of the Erebus and Terror. Hatteras was the first to rouse himself. He ascended quickly a rather high hillock, which was almost entirely bare of snow. "Captain," said Johnson, following him, "from there we ought to see the stores." Shandon and the doctor joined them just as they reached the top of the hill. But there I saw nothing but large plains with no trace of a building. "This is very strange," said the boatswain. "Well, these stores," said Hatteras, quickly. "I don't know, I don't see," stammered Johnson. "You must have mistaken the path," said the doctor. "Still it seems to me," resumed Johnson after a moment's reflection, "that at this very spot—" "Well," said Hatteras, impatiently, "where shall we go?" "Let's go down again," said the boatswain, "for it's possible I've lost my way. In 7 years I may have forgotten the place." "Especially," said the doctor, "when the country is so monotonous." "And yet," muttered Johnson. Shandon said not a word. After walking a few minutes, Johnson stopped. "No," he said, "I'm not mistaken." "Well," said Hatteras, looking around. "What makes you say so, Johnson?" asked the doctor. "Do you see this little rise in the earth?" asked the boatswain, pointing downwards to a mound in which 3 elevations could be clearly seen. "What does that mean?" asked the doctor. "There," answered Johnson, "are the 3 tombs of Franklin's sailors." "I'm sure of it." "I'm not mistaken, and the stores must be within 100 paces of us, and if they are not there, it's because—" He durst not finish his sentence. Hatteras ran forward, and terrible despair seized him. There ought to stand those much-needed storehouses, with supplies of all sorts on which he had been counting, but ruin, pillage, and destruction had passed over that place where civilized hands had accumulated resources for battered sailors. Who had committed these depredations? Wild animals, wolves, foxes, Bears? No, for they would have destroyed only the provisions, and there was left no shred of a tent, not a piece of wood, not a scrap of iron, no bit of any metal, nor what was more serious for the men of the Forward, a single lump of coal. Evidently the Eskimos, who have often had much to do with European ships, had finally learned the value of these objects. Since the visit of the fox they had come frequently to this great storehouse, and had pillaged incessantly, with the intention of leaving no trace of what had been there, and now a long drift of half-melted snow covered the ground. Hatteras was baffled. The doctor gazed and shook his head. Shandon said nothing, but an attentive observer would have noticed a wicked smile about his lips. At this moment the men sent by Wall arrived. They took it all in at a glance. Shandon went up to the captain and said, "Mr. Hatteras, we need not despair. Fortunately we are near the entrance to Barrow Strait, which will carry us back to Baffin's Bay." "Mr. Shandon," answered Hatteras, "we are fortunately near the entrance of Wellington Channel, and it will lead us to the north." "And how shall we go, Captain?" "Under sail, sir. We have 2 months' fuel left, and that is more than we shall need for next winter." "Permit me to say," began Shandon. "I permit you to follow me to the ship, sir," was Hatteras's answer. And turning his back on his first officer, he returned to the brig and locked himself in his cabin. For 2 days the wind was unfavorable. The captain did not come on deck. The doctor profited by this forced delay to examine Beechey Island. He collected a few plants which a comparatively high temperature let grow here and there on some rocks which projected from the snow, such as heather, a few lichens, a sort of yellow ranunculus, a plant like sorrel with leaves a trifle larger, and some sturdy saxifrages. The fauna of this country was much richer. The doctor saw large flocks of geese and cranes flying northward, partridges, eider ducks, northern divers, numerous ptarmigans, which are delicious eating, noisy flocks of kittiwakes, and great white-bellied loons represented the winged tribe. The doctor was lucky enough to kill some grey hares, which had not yet put on their white winter coat of fur, and a blue fox, which Duke skillfully caught. A few bears, evidently accustomed to fear men, could not be approached, and the seals were very timid, probably for the same reason. The harbour was full of a very good-tasting shellfish. The genus Articulator, order Diptera, family Culicides, division Nemocera, was represented by a simple mosquito, a single one, which the doctor, though much bitten, had the pleasure of catching. As a conchologist, he was less fortunate, and he was obliged to content himself with a sort of mussel and some bivalves. Chapter 21. The death of Bellot. The temperature remained at 57 degrees during July 3d and 4th. This was the highest temperature observed. But on Thursday, the 5th, the wind shifted to the southeast, with violent snow squalls. The thermometer fell 23 degrees in the preceding night. Hatteras, indifferent to the hostility of the crew, gave the order to set sail. For 13 days, ever since passing Cape Dundas, the Forward had not gone a single degree farther north. Hence the party represented by Clifton was dissatisfied. Their wishes, it is true, coincided with those of the captain, namely, that they should make their way through Wellington Channel, and they were all glad to be off once more. It was with difficulty that sail was set, but having in the course of the night run up the mainsail and topsails, Hatteras plunged boldly into the ice, which the current was driving towards the south. The crew became very tired of this tortuous navigation, which kept them very busy with the sails. Wellington Channel is not very broad. It lies between North Devon on the east and Cornwallis Island on the west. For a long time this island was considered a peninsula. It was Sir John Franklin who circumnavigated it, in 1846, from the western side, going about its northern coast. The exploration of Wellington Channel was made in 1851 by Captain Penny in the whale ships Lady Franklin and Sophia. One of his lieutenants, Stewart, who reached Cape Beechey, latitude 76 degrees and 20 minutes, discovered the open sea. The open sea! It was for that Hatteras longed. What Stewart found, I shall find, he said to the doctor, and I shall be able to get to the pole under sail. But, answered the doctor, don't you fear lest the crew? The crew, said Hatteras, coldly. Then in a lower tone he murmured, poor men, much to the doctor's surprise. It was the first sentiment of this sort which he had ever noticed in the captain. No, he went on warmly, they must follow me, and they shall. Still, if the Forward need not fear collision with the ice streams, she made but little way northward, being much delayed by contrary winds. With some difficulty they got by Cape Spencer and Innis, and Tuesday, the 10th, latitude 75 degrees was at last reached, much to Clifton's joy. The Forward was now at the very spot where the American ships, the Rescue and the Advance, commanded by Captain Haven, ran such terrible dangers. Dr. Kane accompanied this expedition. Towards the end of September, 1850, these ships were caught in the ice, and carried with irresistible force into Lancaster Sound. Shandon told James Wall about it in the presence of some of the men. The Advance and the Rescue, he said, were so tossed about by ice that they could keep no fires on board, and yet the thermometer stood at 18 degrees below zero. During the whole winter the crews were kept imprisoned, ready to abandon their ships, and for 3 weeks they did not take off their clothes. It was a terrible situation. After drifting 1,000 miles, they were driven to the middle of Baffin's Bay. One may easily judge of the effect of such a narration on a crew already discontented. While this conversation was going on, Johnson was talking with the doctor about an event which had taken place here. The doctor, at his request, told him the exact moment when the brig reached latitude 75 degrees and 30 minutes. "There it is. There it is," said Johnson, "there is that unlucky land." And so speaking, tears came into the boatswain's eyes. "You mean Lieutenant Bellott's death," said the doctor. "Yes, sir, of that brave, good man." "And it was here, you say, that it took place?" "Just here, on this part of the coast of North Devon." "It was very great ill luck, and this would not have happened if Captain Pullen had come on board sooner." "What do you mean, Johnson?" "Listen, doctor, and you will see by how slight a thread life is held. You know that Lieutenant Bellot had already made an expedition in search of Franklin, in 1850. Yes, in the Prince Albert. Well, in 1853, having returned to France, he got permission to sail in the Phoenix, in which I was a sailor, under Captain Inglefield. We came with the Breadalbane to carry supplies to Beechey Island. Those which we did not find. Exactly, doctor. We arrived at Beechey Island at the beginning of August, the 10th of that month. Captain Inglefield left the Phoenix to rejoin Captain Pullen, who had been away for a month from his ship, the North Star. He intended on his return to send the Admiralty dispatches to Sir Edward Belcher, who was wintering in Wellington Channel. Now, shortly after our captain's departure, Captain Pullen reached his ship. If he had only come back before Captain Inglefield had left! Lieutenant Bellot, fearing that our captain's absence might be a long one, and knowing that the Admiralty dispatches were important, offered to carry them himself. He left the 2 ships under Captain Pullen's charge, and left August 12th with a sledge and an India-rubber canoe. He took with him Harvey, quartermaster of the North Star, and 3 sailors, Madden, David Hook, and me. We thought that Sir Edward Belcher would be somewhere near Cape Beecher, at the northern part of the channel, hence we made for that part in our sledge, keeping on the east bank. The first day we encamped 3 miles from Cape Innes, the next day we stopped on the ice nearly 3 miles from Cape Bowden. During the night, which was as bright as day, land being only 3 miles distant, Lieutenant Bellot determined to go and camp there. He tried to reach it in the canoe. A violent southeast breeze drove him back twice. Harvey and Madden tried in their turn, and with success. They carried a rope, and with it they established communication with the shore. 3 objects were carried across by it, but at the 4th attempt, we felt the ice moving away from us. Mr. Bellot shouted to his companions to loosen the rope, and we, the lieutenant, David Hook, and I, were carried to a great distance from the shore. Then a strong southeaster was blowing, and snow was falling. But we were not in any great danger, and he might have been saved, since the rest of us were saved. Johnson stopped for a moment and gazed at the ill-fated shore. Then he went on. After losing sight of our companions, we tried at first to shelter ourselves under the cover of our sledge, but in vain. Then with our knives we began to cut a house in the ice. Mr. Bellot sat down for half an hour and talked with us about the danger of our situation. I told him I was not afraid. With God's protection, he said, not a hair of our heads shall be hurt. I then asked him what time it was. He answered, "About 6:15. It was 6:15 in the morning of Thursday, August 18th. Then Mr. Belloc bound on his books, and said he wanted to go and see how the ice was moving. He was gone only 4 minutes, when I went to seek him behind the floe which sheltered us, but I did not find him, and, returning to our retreat, I saw his stick on the opposite side of a crevasse about 3 fathoms wide, where the ice was all broken. I shouted, but there was no answer. At that time the wind was blowing very hard. I searched all around, but I could find no trace of the poor lieutenant." "And what do you suppose became of him?" asked the doctor, who was much moved by this account. "I suppose that when he left the shelter, the wind drove him into the crevasse, and that, being thickly clad, he could not swim to the surface." "Oh, Dr. Clawbonny, I never felt worse in my life. I could not believe it. That brave officer fell a victim to his sense of duty. For you know that it was in order to obey Captain Pullen's instructions that he was trying to reach the land before the ice began to break. He was a brave man, liked by every one, faithful, courageous. All England mourned him, and even the Eskimos, when they heard of his death from Captain Inglefield, when he returned from Pound Bay, did nothing but weep and repeat, 'Poor Belloc! Poor Belloc!' But you and your companions, Johnson," asked the doctor, much moved by this touching account, "how did you manage to get to shore?" "Oh, it was very simple. We remained 24 hours on the ice without food or fire, but finally we reached a firmly fastened ice field. We sprang upon it, and with an oar we got near a floe capable of supporting us, and being controlled like a boat. In that way we reached the shore, but alone, without our brave officer." At the end of this account the Forward had passed by this fatal shore, and Johnson soon lost sight of the scene of this terrible catastrophe. The next day they left Griffin's Bay on the starboard, and 2 days later, Capes Grinnell and Helpman. Finally, July 14th, they doubled Osborne Point, and the 15th the brig anchored in Bering Bay at the end of the channel. The navigation had not been very difficult. Hatteras found a sea nearly as free as that by which Belcher profited to go and winter with the Pioneer and assistants in latitude 77 degrees. That was his first winter, 1852–53, for the next he spent in Bering Bay, where the Forward now lay at anchor. It was in consequence of the most terrible dangers and trials that he was obliged to abandon the assistants in the midst of the eternal ice. Shandon gave a full account of this catastrophe to the demoralized sailors. Was Hatteras aware of the treachery of his first officer? It is impossible to say, but, at any rate, he said nothing about it. At the end of Bering Bay is a narrow canal uniting Wellington Channel with Queen Strait. There the ice had accumulated very closely. Hatteras made vain efforts to get through the passages to the north of Hamilton Island. The wind was unfavorable, hence it was necessary to go between Hamilton and Cornwallis Islands. 5 precious days were lost in vain attempts. The air grew colder, and July 19th fell as low as 26 degrees. The next day was warmer, but this harbinger of the Arctic winter warned Hatteras not to linger longer. The wind seemed to blow steadily from the west and delayed his progress. And yet he was in haste to reach the point whence Stuart saw an open sea. The 19th he resolved to enter the channel at any price. The wind blew dead against the brig, which, with her screw, could have made headway against the violent snow squalls, but Hatteras had before all to be economical with the fuel. On the other hand, the channel was too broad to permit of the brig being towed. Hatteras, without taking into account the fatigue of his crew, made use of a device which whalers often employ under similar circumstances. He lowered the small boats to the surface of the water, not letting them free from their tackle. Then they were made fast, fore and aft. Oars were put out, to starboard on one side and to port on the other. The men sat on the thwarts and rowed vigorously, so as to propel the brig against the wind. The Forward made slight headway. This method of working was very fatiguing. The men began to murmur. For 4 days they advanced in that way, until July 23d, when they reached Bering Island, in Queen's Channel. The wind was still unfavorable. The crew could go no farther. The doctor found the strength of the crew much pulled down, and he thought he detected the first symptoms of scurvy. He used every precaution against this terrible disease, having abundant supplies of lime juice and chalk pastils. Hatteras soon saw there was nothing more to be got from his crew. Kindness and persuasion were fruitless. he resolved to employ severity, and, if need be, to be pitiless. He distrusted especially Richard Shandon, and even James Wall, who, however, never dared to speak too loud. Hatteras had on his side the Doctor, Johnson, Bell, and Simpson. These were all devoted to him body and soul. Among the uncertain were Fokker, Bolton, Woolston, the gunner, Brunton, the first engineer, who might at any moment declare against him. As to the others, Penn, Gripper, Clifton, and Warren, they openly meditated mutiny. They wanted to bring their companions over and compel the Forward to return to England. Hatteras soon saw that he could get no more work from his dispirited crew, who now were worn out with fatigue from their hard work. For 24 hours they remained in sight of Bering Island without getting a foot forward. Still the weather grew colder, and in these high latitudes even July felt the influence of the approaching winter. The 24th, the thermometer fell to 22 degrees. The young ice formed during the night to a depth of about half an inch. If snow should fall on it, it would soon be strong enough to bear the weight of a man. The sea soon acquired the turbid tint which indicates the formation of the first crystals. Hatteras read aright these alarming signs. If the passes should close, he would be obliged to winter here, far from the aim of his voyage, and without even having seen that open sea which he must have got very near, according to the accounts of his predecessors. Hence he resolved to get on at any price a few degrees farther north, seeing that he could neither try rowing with his crew exhausted, nor going under sail with the wind always unfavourable. He ordered the fires to be lighted. Chapter 22. The first signs of mutiny. At this unexpected command, the surprise on board of the Forward was very great. "Light the fires," said some. "With what?" said others. "When we have only 2 months' supply in the hold," cried Penn. "And how are we to keep warm in the winter?" asked Clifton. "We shall have to burn the ship down to the water line, I suppose," said Gripper. "And cram all the masts into the stove," answered Warren, "from the foretopmast to the jib-boom." Shandon gazed intently at Wall. The surprised engineers hesitated to go down into the engine room. "Did you hear what I said?" shouted the captain, angrily. Brunton walked toward the hatchway, but he stopped before going down. "Don't go, Brunton," someone said. "Who spoke then?" shouted Hatteras. "I did," said Penn, approaching the captain. "And what is it you're saying?" asked the captain. I say, answered Penn with many oaths, "I say that we have had enough of this, that we are not going any farther, that we don't want to wear ourselves out with fatigue and cold during the winter, and that the fires shall not be lighted." "Mr. Shandon," answered Hatteras, coldly, "have this man put in irons." "But, Captain," said Shandon, "what this man said, if you repeat what this man said," retorted Hatteras, "I shall order you to your cabin and confine you there. Seize that man. Do you hear?" Johnson, Bell, and Simpson stepped towards the sailor, who was beside himself with wrath. "The first man who lays a finger on me," he cried, seizing a handspike, which he flourished about his head. Hatteras walked towards him. "Penn," he said very quietly, "if you move hand or foot, I shall blow your brains out." With these words he drew a revolver and aimed it at the sailor. A murmur arose from the crew. "Not a word from any of you," said Hatteras, "or he's a dead man." At that moment Johnson and Bell disarmed Penn, who no longer resisted, and suffered himself to be led to the bottom of the hold. "Now go below, Brunton," said Hatteras. The engineer, followed by Plover and Warren, went below. Hatteras returned to the quarterdeck. "That Penn is a worthless fellow," the doctor said to him. "No man was ever nearer death," answered the captain, simply. Soon there was enough steam on. The anchors of the Forward were raised, and the brig started eastward, heading for Point Beecher and cutting through the newly formed ice. A great number of islands lie between Bering Island and Point Beecher, scattered in the midst of the ice fields. The ice streams crowd in great numbers in the little straits into which they divide the sea. When the weather is cold they have a tendency to accumulate. Here and there hummocks were forming, and it was easy to see that the floes, already harder and more crowded, would, under the influence of the first frosts, soon form an impenetrable mass. It was with great difficulty that the Forward made her way through the whirling snow. Still, with the variability which is a peculiarity of these regions, the sun would appear from time to time. The air grew much milder. The ice melted as if by enchantment, and a clear expanse of water, a most welcome sight to the eyes of the crew, spread out before them where a few moments before the ice had blocked their progress. All over the horizon there spread magnificent orange tints, which rested their eyes, weary with gazing at the eternal snow. Thursday, July 26th, the Forward coasted along Dundas Island, and then stood more northward, but there she found herself face to face with a thick mass of ice, 8 or 9 feet high, consisting of little icebergs washed away from the shore. They had to prolong the curve they were making to the west. The continual cracking of the ice, joining with the creaking of the rolling ship, sounded like a gloomy lamentation. At last the brig found a passage and advanced through it slowly. Often a huge floe delayed her for hours. The fog embarrassed the steersman. At one moment he could see a mile ahead, and it was easy to avoid all obstacles, but again the snow squalls would hide everything from their sight at the distance of a cable's length. The sea ran very high. Sometimes the smooth clouds assumed a strange appearance, as if they were reflecting the ice banks. There were days when the sun could not pierce the dense mist. The birds were still very numerous, and their cries were deafening. The seals, lying lazily on the drifting ice, raised their heads without being frightened, and turned their long necks to watch the ship go by. Often, too, the brig would leave bits of sheathing on the ice against which she grazed. Finally, after 6 days of this slow sailing, August 1st, Point Beecher was made, sighted in the north. Hatteras passed the last hours in the lookout, the open sea, which Stuart had seen May 30th, 1851, towards latitude 76 degrees and 20 minutes, could not be far off, and yet, as far as Hatteras could see, he could make out no sign of an open polar sea. He came down without saying a word. "Do you believe in an open sea?" asked Shandon of the second mate. "I'm beginning to have my doubts," answered James Wall. "Wasn't I right in considering this pretended discovery as a mere hypothesis? No one agreed with me, and you too, Wall, you sided against me. They'll believe you next time, Shandon." "Yes," he answered, "when it's too late." And he returned to his cabin, where he had kept himself almost exclusively since his discussion with the captain. Towards evening the wind shifted to the south. Hatteras then set his sails and had the fires put out. For many days the crew were kept hard at work. Every few minutes they had to tack or bear away, or to shorten sail quickly to stop the course of the brig. The braces could not run easily through the choked-up pulleys, and added to the fatigue of the crew. More than a week was required for them to reach Point Barrow. The Forward had not made 30 miles in 10 days. Then the wind flew around to the north, and the engine was started once more. Hatteras still hoped to find an open sea beyond latitude 77 degrees, such as Edward Belcher had seen. And yet, if he believed in Penny's account, the part of the sea which he was now crossing ought to have been open, for Penny, having reached the limit of the ice, saw in a canoe the shores of Queen's Channel at latitude 77 degrees. Must he regard their reports as apocryphal, or had an unusually early winter fallen upon these regions? August 15th, Mount Percy reared into the mist, its peaks covered with eternal snow. A violent wind was hurling in their teeth a fierce shower of hail. The next day the sun set for the first time, terminating at last the long series of days 24 hours long. The men had finally accustomed themselves to this perpetual daylight, but the animals minded it very little. The Greenland dogs used to go to sleep at the usual hour, and even Duke lay down at the same hour every evening, as if the night were dark. Still, during the nights following August 16th the darkness was never very marked. The sun, although it had set, still gave light enough by refraction. August 19th, after taking a satisfactory observation, Cape Franklin was seen on the eastern side, and opposite it Cape Lady Franklin, at what was probably the farthest point reached by this bold explorer. His fellow countryman wanted the name of his devoted wife should be remembered along with his own, as an emblem of the sympathy which always united them. The doctor was much moved by this sight in this distant country. In accordance with Johnson's advice, he began to accustom himself to enduring low temperature. He kept almost all the time on deck, braving the cold, wind, and snow. Although he had grown a little thinner, he did not suffer from the severity of the climate. Besides, he expected other dangers, and he rejoiced, almost, as he saw the winter approaching. "See," said he one day to Johnson, "see those flocks of birds flying south. How they fly and cry at you." "Yes, Dr. Clawbonny," answered Johnson, "something has told them it was time to go, and they are off. More than one of our men, Johnson, would be glad to imitate them, I fancy. They are timid fellows, Doctor. What a bird can't do, a man ought to try. Those birds have no supply of food, as we have, and they must support themselves elsewhere. But sailors, with a good deck under the feet, ought to go to the end of the world. You hope, then, that Hatteras will succeed in his projects?" "He will succeed, Doctor." "I agree with you, Johnson, even if only one faithful man accompanies him." "There will be two of us." "Yes, Johnson," the doctor answered, pressing the brave sailor's hand. Prince Albert's Land, along which the Forward was now coasting, is also called Grinnell's Land, and although Hatteras, from his dislike to Americans, never was willing to give it this name, nevertheless, it is the one by which it is generally known. This is the reason of this double title, at the same time that the Englishman Penny gave it the name of Prince Albert. The captain of the rescue, Lieutenant de Haven, named it Grinnell's Land, in honor of the American merchant who had fitted out the expedition in New York. As the brig followed the coast, it met with serious difficulties, going sometimes under sail, sometimes under steam. August 18th, Mount Britannia was sighted through the mist, and the next day the Forward cast anchor in Northumberland Bay. The ship was completely protected. Chapter 23. Attack by the ice. Hatteras, after seeing to the anchorage of the ship, returned to his cabin, took out his chart, and marked his position on it very carefully. He found himself in latitude 76 degrees and 57 minutes, and longitude 99 degrees and 20 minutes, that is to say, only 3 minutes from latitude 77 degrees. It was here that Sir Edward Belcher passed his first winter with the Pioneer and assistants. It was from here that he organized his sledge and canoe expeditions. He discovered Table Island, North Cornwall, Victoria Archipelago, and Belcher Channel. Having gone beyond latitude 78 degrees, he saw the coast inclining towards the southeast. It seemed as if it ought to connect with Jones's Strait, which opens into Baffin's Bay. But, says the report, an open sea, in the northwest, stretched as far as the eye could reach. Hatteras gazed with emotion at that portion of the charts where a large white space marked unknown regions, and his eyes always returned to the open polar sea. After so many statements, he said to himself, after the accounts of Stewart, Penny, and Belcher, doubt is impossible. These bold sailors saw, and with their own eyes. Can I doubt their word? No. But yet if this sea is closed by an early winter. But no, these discoveries have been made at intervals of several years. This sea exists, and I shall find it. I shall see it. Hatteras went upon the quarter-deck. A dense mist enveloped the Forward. From the deck one could hardly see the top of the mast. Nevertheless, Hatteras ordered the ice master below, and took his place. He wanted to make use of the first break in the fog to look at the horizon in the northwest. Shandon took occasion to say to the second mate, "Well, Wall, and the open sea." "You were right, Shandon," answered Wall, "and we have only 6 weeks' coal in the bunkers." "The doctor will invent some scientific way," continued Shandon, "of heating us without fuel. I've heard of making ice with fire, perhaps he will make fire with ice." Shandon returned to his cabin, shrugging his shoulders. The next day, August 20th, the fog lifted for a few minutes. From the deck they saw Hatteras in his lofty perch gazing intently towards the horizon. Then he came down without saying a word and ordered them to set sail, but it was easy to see that his hopes had been once more deceived. The Forward heaved anchor and resumed her uncertain path northward. So wearisome was it that the main topsail and fore topsail yards were lowered with all their rigging, the masts were also lowered, and it was no longer possible to place any reliance on the varying wind, which, moreover, the winding nature of the passes made almost useless. Large white masses were gathering here and there in the sea, like spots of oil. They indicated an approaching thaw. As soon as the wind began to slacken, the sea began to freeze again, but when the wind arose this young ice would break and disperse. Towards evening the thermometer fell to 17 degrees. When the brig arrived at the end of a closed pass, it rushed on at full steam against the opposing obstacle. Sometimes they thought her fairly stopped, but some unexpected motion of the ice streams would open a new passage into which she would plunge boldly. During these stoppages the steam would escape from the safety valves and fall on the deck in the form of snow. There was another obstacle to the progress of the brig. The ice would get caught in the screw, and it was so hard that the engine could not break it. It was then necessary to reverse the engines, turn the brig back, and send some men to free the snow with axes and levers. Hence arose many difficulties, fatigues, and delays. It went on in this way for 13 days. The Forward advanced slowly through Penny Strait. The crew murmured, but obeyed. They knew that retreat was now impossible. The advance towards the north was less perilous than a return to the south. It was time to think of going into winter quarters. The sailors talked together about their condition, and one day they even began to talk with Shandon, who, they knew, was on their side. He so far forgot his duty as an officer as to allow them to discuss in his presence the authority of his captain. "So you say, Mr. Shandon," asked Gripper, "that we can't go back now?" "No, it's too late," answered Shandon. "Then," said another sailor, "we need only look forward to going into winter quarters. It's our only resource." "No one would believe me." "The next time," said Penn, who had returned to duty, "they will believe you." "Since I shan't be in command," answered Shandon. "Who can tell?" remarked Penn. "John Hatteras is free to go as far as he chooses, but no one is obliged to follow him." "Just remember," resumed Gripper, "his first voyage to Baffin's Bay and what came of it." "And the voyage of the Farewell," said Clifton, "which was lost in the Spitzbergen seas under his command." "And from which he came back alone," added Gripper. "Alone, but with his dog," said Clifton. "We don't care to sacrifice ourselves for the whims of that man," continued Penn. "Nor to lose all the wages we've earned so hard." They all recognized Clifton by those words. "When we pass latitude 78 degrees, he added, "and we are not far from it, that will make just £375 for each man, 6 times 8 degrees. "But," asked Gripper, "shan't we lose them if we go back without the captain?" "No," answered Clifton, "if we can prove that it was absolutely necessary to return." "But the captain still." "Don't be uneasy, Gripper," answered Penn, "we shall have a captain, and a good one, whom Mr. Shandon knows. When a captain goes mad, he is dismissed and another appointed. Isn't that so, Mr. Shandon?" "My friends," answered Shandon evasively, "you will always find me devoted to you. But let us wait and see what turns up." The storm, as may be seen, was gathering over Hatteras's head, but he pushed on boldly, firm, energetic, and confident. In fact, if he had not always managed the brig as he wanted to, and carried her where he was anxious to go, he had still been very successful. The distance passed over in 5 months was as great as what it had taken other explorers 2 or 3 years to make. Hatteras was now obliged to go into winter quarters, but this would not alarm men of courage, experience, and confidence. Had not Sir John Ross and Macclure spent 3 successive winters in the Arctic regions? Could not he do what they had done? Yes, of course, Hatteras used to say, and more too, if need be. "Ah," he said regretfully to the doctor, "why was I unable to get through Smith Sound, at the north of Baffin's Bay? I should be at the pole now." Well, the doctor used invariably to answer, if necessary he could have invented confidence, "We shall get there, Captain, but, it is true, at the 99th meridian instead of the 75th, but what difference does that make? If every road leads to Rome, it is even surer that every meridian leads to the pole." August 31st, the thermometer fell to 13 degrees. The end of the summer was evidently near. The Forward left Exmouth Island to starboard, and 3 days afterward she passed Table Island, lying in the middle of Belcher Channel. Earlier in the season it would have been possible to reach Baffin's Bay through this channel, but at this time it was impossible to think of it. This arm of the sea was completely filled with ice, and would not have offered a drop of open water to the prow of the Forward. For the next 8 months their eyes would see nothing but boundless, motionless ice fields. Fortunately, they could still get a few minutes farther north, but only by breaking the new ice with huge beams, or by blowing it up with charges of powder. They especially had cause to fear calm weather while the temperature was so low, for the passes closed quickly, and they rejoiced even at contrary winds. A calm night, and everything was frozen. Now the Forward could not winter where she was exposed to the wind, icebergs, and the drift of the channel. A safe protection was the first thing to be found. Hatteras hoped to gain the coast of New Cornwall, and to find, beyond Point Albert, a bay sufficiently sheltered. Hence he persisted in crowding northward. But September 8th, an impenetrable, continuous mass of ice lay between him and the north. The temperature fell to 10 degrees. Hatteras, with an anxious heart, in vain sought for a passage, risking his ship 100 times and escaping from his perils with wonderful skill. He might have been accused of imprudence, recklessness, folly, blindness, but he was one of the best of sailors. The situation of the Forward became really dangerous. In fact, the sea was closing behind her, and in a few hours the ice grew so hard that men could run upon it and tow the brig in perfect safety. Hatteras, not being able to get around this obstacle, determined to attack it boldly in front. He made use of his strongest blasting cylinders, containing 8 or 10 pounds of powder. The men would dig a hole in the broadest part of the ice, close the orifice with snow, after having placed the cylinder in a horizontal position so that a greater extent of ice might be exposed to the explosion. Then a fuse was lighted, which was protected by a gutta-percha tube. In this way they tried to break the ice. It was impossible to saw it, for the fissures would close immediately. Still, Hatteras was hoping to get through the next day. But during the night the wind blew a gale, the sea raised the crust of ice, and the terrified pilot was heard shouting, "Look out there aft! Look out there aft!" Hatteras turned his eyes in that direction, and what he saw in the dim light was indeed alarming. A great mass of ice, drifting northward with the tide, was rushing towards the brig with the speed of an avalanche. "All hands on deck," shouted the captain. This floating mountain was hardly half a mile away. The ice was all in confusion and crashing together like huge grains of sand before a violent tempest. The air was filled with a terrible noise. "That, Doctor," said Johnson, "is one of the greatest perils we have yet met with." "Yes," answered the doctor, quietly, "it is terrible enough." "A real attack which we must repel," resumed the boatswain. "In fact, one might well think it was an immense crowd of antediluvian animals, such as might have lived near the pole. How they hurry on, as if they were racing! Besides," added Johnson, "some carry sharp lances, of which you had better take care, Doctor." "It's a real siege," shouted the doctor. "Well, let us run to the ramparts." He ran aft where the crew, provided with beams and bars, were standing ready to repel this formidable assault. The avalanche came on, growing larger at every moment as it caught up the floating ice in its eddy. By Hatteras's orders the cannon was loaded with ball to break the threatening line. But it came on and ran towards the brig. A crash was heard, and as it came against the starboard quarter, part of the rail had given way. "Let no one stir," shouted Hatteras. "Look out for the ice!" They swarmed on board the ship with an irresistible force. Lumps of ice, weighing many hundredweight, scaled the sides of the ship. The smallest, hurled as high as the yards, fell back in sharp arrows, breaking the shrouds and cutting the rigging. The men were overcome by numberless enemies, who were heavy enough to crush 100 ships like the Forward. Everyone tried to drive away these lumps, and more than one sailor was wounded by their sharp ends, among others, Bolton, who had his left shoulder badly torn. The noise increased immensely. Duke barked angrily at these new enemies. The darkness of the night added to the horrors of the situation, without hiding the ice which glowed in the last light of the evening. Hatteras's orders sounded above all this strange, impossible, supernatural conflict of the men with the ice. The ship, yielding to this enormous pressure, inclined to larboard, and the end of the mainyard was already touching the ice, at the risk of breaking the mast. Hatteras saw the danger. It was a terrible moment. The brig seemed about to be overturned, and the masts might be easily carried away. A large block, as large as the ship, appeared to be passing along the keel. It arose with irresistible power. It came on past the quarter-deck. If it fell on the Forward, all was over. Soon it rose even above the topmasts, and began to totter. A cry of terror escaped from every one's lips. Every one ran back to starboard. But at that moment the ship was relieved. They felt her lifted up, and for an instant she hung in the air. Then she leaned over and fell back on the ice, and then she rolled so heavily that her planks cracked. What had happened? Raised by this rising tide, driven by the ice which attacked her aft, she was getting across this impenetrable ice. After a minute of this strange sailing, which seemed as long as a century, she fell back on the other side of the obstacle on a field of ice. She broke it with her weight, and fell back into her natural element. "We have got by the thick ice," shouted Johnson, who had run forward. "Thank God," said Hatteras. In fact, the brig lay in the center of a basin of ice, which entirely surrounded her, and although her keel lay under water she could not stir, but if she were motionless, the field was drifting along. "We are drifting, Captain," shouted Johnson. "All right," answered Hatteras. Indeed, how was it possible to resist it? Day broke, and it was evident that under the influence of a submarine current the bank of ice was floating northward with great rapidity. This floating mass carried the Forward with it, in the midst of the ice field, the edge of which could not be seen. To provide for any accident that might happen, Hatteras had a large supply of provisions carried on deck, as well as materials for camping, clothing, and cover. As McClure had done under similar circumstances, he surrounded the ship with hammocks filled with air to protect her from damage. Soon it was so cold, 7 degrees, that the ship was surrounded by a wall from which only the masts issued. For 7 days they sailed in this way. Point Albert, which forms the western extremity of New Cornwall, was seen September 10th and soon disappeared. The ice field was seen to be drifting eastward from that time. Where was it going? Where would it stop? Who could say? The crew waited with folded arms. At last, September 15th, towards 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the ice field, having probably run against another one, stopped suddenly. The ship was jarred violently. Hatteras, who had kept his reckoning all along, looked at his chart. He found himself in the north, with no land in sight, in longitude 95 degrees and 35 minutes, and latitude 78 degrees and 15 minutes, in the center of the region of the unknown sea, which geographers have considered the place of greatest cold. Chapter 24. Preparations for wintering. The same latitude is colder in the southern than in the northern hemisphere, but the temperature of the New World is 15 degrees beneath that of the other parts of the world, and in America these countries, known under the name of the region of greatest cold, are the most inclement. The mean temperature for the whole year is 2 degrees below zero. Physicists have explained this fact in the following way, and Dr. Clawbonny shared their opinion. According to them, the most constant winds in the northern regions of America are from the southwest. They come from the Pacific Ocean, with an equal and agreeable temperature, but before they reach the Arctic seas they are obliged to cross the great American continent, which is covered with snow. The contact chills them, and communicates to these regions their intense cold. Hatteras found himself at the pole of cold, beyond the countries seen by his predecessors. He consequently expected a terrible winter, on a ship lost amid the ice, with a turbulent crew. He resolved to meet these dangers with his usual energy. He faced what awaited him without flinching. He began, with Johnson's aid and experience, to take all the measures necessary for going into winter quarters. According to his calculation, the Forward had been carried 250 miles from any known land, that is to say, from North Cornwall. She was firmly fixed in a field of ice, as in a bed of granite, and no human power could extricate her. There was not a drop of open water in these vast seas chained by the fierce Arctic winter. The ice field stretched away out of sight, but without presenting a smooth surface. Far from it. Numerous icebergs stood up in the icy plain, and the Forward was sheltered by the highest of them on 3 points of the compass. The southeast wind alone reached them. Let one imagine rock instead of ice, verdure instead of snow, and the sea again liquid, and the brig would have quietly cast anchor in a pretty bay, sheltered from the fiercest blasts. But what desolation here! What a gloomy prospect! What a melancholy view! The brig, although motionless, nevertheless had to be fastened securely by means of anchors. This was a necessary precaution against possible thaws and submarine upheavals. Johnson, on hearing that the Forward was at the pole of cold, took even greater precautions for securing warmth. "We shall have it severe enough," he had said to the doctor. "That's just the captain's luck, to go and get caught at the most disagreeable spot on the globe." Bah! You will see that we shall get out of it. As to the doctor, at the bottom of his heart he was simply delighted. He would not have changed it for any other. Winter at the pole of cold! What good luck! At first, work on the outside occupied the crew. The sails were kept furled on the yards instead of being placed at the bottom of the hold, as the earlier explorers did. They were merely bound up in a case, and soon the frost covered them with a dense envelope. The topmasts were not unshipped, and the crow's nest remained in its place. It was a natural observatory. The running rigging alone was taken down. It became necessary to cut away the ice from the ship to relieve the pressure. That which had accumulated outside was quite heavy, and the ship did not lie as deep as usual. This was a long and laborious task. At the end of some days the ship's bottom was freed, and could be inspected. It had not suffered, thanks to its solidity, only its copper sheathing was nearly torn away. The ship, having grown lighter, drew about 9 inches less than she did earlier. The ice was cut away in a slope, following the make of the hull. In this way the ice formed beneath the brig's keel and so resisted all pressure. The doctor took part in this work. He managed the ice cutter well. He encouraged the sailors by his good humor. He instructed the man himself. He approved of this arrangement of the ice beneath the ship. "That is a good precaution," he said. "Without that, Dr. Clawbonny," answered Johnson, "resistance would be impossible. Now we can boldly raise a wall of snow as high as the gunwale, and, if we want to, we can make it 10 feet thick, for there is no lack of material." "A capital idea," resumed the doctor. "The snow is a bad conductor of heat. It reflects instead of absorbing, and the inside temperature cannot escape." "True," answered Johnson. "We are building a fortification against the cold, and also against the animals, if they care to visit us. When that is finished, it will look well. You may be sure in this snow we shall cut 2 staircases, one fore, the other aft. When the steps are cut in the snow, we shall pour water on them. This will freeze as hard as stone, and we shall have a royal staircase." "Precisely," answered the doctor, "and it must be said it is fortunate that cold produces both snow and ice, by which to protect oneself against it. Without that, one would be very much embarrassed." In fact, the ship was destined to disappear beneath a thick casing of ice, which was needed to preserve its inside temperature. A roof made of thick tarred canvas and covered with snow was built above the deck over its whole length. The canvas was low enough to cover the sides of the ship. The deck, being protected from all outside impressions, became their walk. It was covered with 2.5 feet of snow. This snow was crowded and beaten down so as to become very hard, so it resisted the radiation of the internal heat. Above it was placed a layer of sand, which as it solidified became a sort of macadamized cover of great hardness. "A little more," said the doctor, "and with a few trees I might imagine myself at Hyde Park, or even in the Hanging Gardens at Babylon." A trench was dug tolerably near the brig. This was a circular space in the ice, a real pit, which had to be kept always open. Every morning the ice formed overnight was broken. This was to secure water in case of fire or for the baths which were ordered the crew by the doctor. In order to spare the fuel, the water was drawn from some distance below the ice, where it was less cold. This was done by means of an instrument devised by a French physicist, François Arago. This apparatus, lowered for some distance into the water, brought it up to the surface through a cylinder. Generally in winter everything which encumbers the ship is removed and stored on land. But what was practicable near land is impossible for a ship anchored on the ice. Every preparation was made to fight the 2 great enemies of this latitude, cold and dampness. The first produces the second, which is far more dangerous. The cold may be resisted by one who succumbs to dampness, hence it was necessary to guard against it. The Forward, being destined to a journey in Arctic seas, contained the best arrangements for winter quarters. The large room for the crew was well provided for. The corners, where dampness first forms, were shut off. In fact, when the temperature is very low, a film of ice forms on the walls, especially in the corners, and when it melts it keeps up a perpetual dampness. If it had been round, the room would have been more convenient, but, being heated by a large stove, and properly ventilated, it was very comfortable. The walls were lined with deerskins, not with wool, for wool absorbs the condensed moisture and keeps the air full of dampness. Farther aft the walls of the quarter were taken down, and the officers had a larger common room, better ventilated, and heated by a stove. This room, like that of the crew, had a sort of antechamber, which cut off all communication with the outside. In this way, the heat could not be lost, and one passed gradually from one temperature to the other. In the anterooms were left the snow-covered clothes. the shoes were cleansed on the scrapers, so as to prevent the introduction of any unwholesomeness with one into the room. Canvas hose served to introduce air for the draft of the stoves, other pieces of hose permitted the steam to escape. In addition, 2 condensers were placed in the 2 rooms, and collected this vapor instead of letting it form into water. Twice a week they were emptied, and often they contained several bushels of ice. It was so much taken from the enemy. The fire was perfectly and easily controlled. By means of the canvas hose, by use of merely a small quantity of coal, it was easy to keep the temperature of 50 degrees. Still, Hatteras, having examined the bunkers, soon saw that the greatest economy was necessary, for there was not 2 months' fuel on board. A drying room was set apart for the clothes which were to be washed. They could not be dried in the open air, for they would freeze and tear. The delicate pieces of the machinery were carefully taken down, and the room which contained them was hermetically closed. The life on board became the object of serious meditation. Hatteras regulated it with the utmost caution, and the order of the day was posted up in the common room. The men arose at 6 o'clock in the morning. 3 times a week the hammocks were aired. Every morning the floors were scoured with hot sand. Tea was served at every meal, and the bill of fare varied as much as possible for every day of the week. It consisted of bread, farina, suet, and raisins for puddings, sugar, cocoa, tea, rice, lemon juice, potted meats, salt beef and pork, cabbages, and vegetables in vinegar. The kitchen lay outside of the living rooms. Its heat was consequently lost, but cooking is a perpetual source of evaporation and dampness. The health of the men depends a great deal on the sort of food they get. In high latitudes, the greatest amount of animal food ought to be eaten. The doctor had supervised the sort of food to be given. We ought to follow the Eskimos, he used to say. They have received their lessons from nature, and are our masters in that. If the Arabs and Africans can content themselves with a few dates and a handful of rice, here it is important to eat, and to eat a good deal. The Eskimos take from 10 to 15 pounds of oil a day. If that fare does not please you, we must try food rich in sugar and fat. In a word, we need carbon, so let us manufacture carbon. It is well to put coal in the stove, but don't let us forget to fill that precious stove we carry about with us. With this bill of fare, strict cleanliness was enforced. Every other day each man was obliged to bathe in the half-frozen water which the iron pump brought up, and this was an excellent way of preserving their health. The doctor set the example. He did it at first as a thing which ought to be very disagreeable, but this pretext was quickly forgotten, for he soon took real pleasure in this healthy bath. When work or hunting or distant expeditions took the men off in the severe cold, they had to take special care not to be frostbitten. If they were, rubbing with snow would restore the circulation. Moreover, the men, who all wore woolen clothes, put on coats of deerskin and trousers of sealskin, which perfectly resist the wind. The different arrangements of the ship, the getting to rights on board, took about 3 weeks, and they reached October 10th without any special incident. Chapter 25. One of James Ross's foxes. On that day the thermometer fell to 3 degrees below zero. The day was calm, the cold was very endurable in the absence of wind. Hatteras took advantage of the clearness of the air to reconnoiter the surrounding plains. He ascended one of the highest icebergs to the north, but even with his glass he could make out nothing but a series of ice mountains and ice fields. There was no land in sight, nothing but gloomy confusion. He returned, and tried to calculate the probable length of their imprisonment. The hunters, and among them the doctor, James Wall, Simpson, Johnson, and Bell, kept them supplied with fresh meat. The birds had disappeared, seeking a milder climate in the south. The ptarmigans alone, a sort of rock partridge peculiar to this latitude, did not flee the winter. It was easy to kill them, and there were enough to promise a perpetual supply of game. Hares, foxes, wolves, ermines, and bears were plentiful. A French, English, or Norwegian hunter would have had no right to complain, but they were so shy that it was hard to approach them. Besides, it was hard to distinguish them on the white plain, they being white themselves, for in winter they acquire that colored fur. In opposition to the opinions of some naturalists, the doctor held that this change was not due to the lowering of the temperature, since it took place before October, hence it was not due to any physical cause, but rather providential foresight to secure these animals against the severity of an Arctic winter. Often, too, they saw sea cows and sea dogs, Animals included under the name of seals, all the hunters were specially recommended to shoot them, as much for their skins as for their fat, which was very good fuel. Besides, their liver made a very good article of food. They could be counted by hundreds, and 2 or 3 miles north of the ship the ice was continually perforated by these huge animals, only they avoided the hunter with remarkable instinct, and many were wounded who easily escaped by diving under the ice. Still, on the 19th, Simpson succeeded in getting one 400 yards distant from the ship. He had taken the precaution to close its hole in the ice, so that it could not escape from its pursuers. He fought for a long time, and died only after receiving many bullets. He was 9 feet long, his bulldog head, the 16 teeth in his jaw, his large pectoral fins shaped like little wings, his little tail with another pair of fins, made him an excellent specimen. The doctor wished to preserve his head for his collection of natural history, and his skin for future contingencies, hence he prepared both by a rapid and economical process. He plunged the body in the hole, and thousands of little prawns removed the flesh in small pieces. At the end of half a day the work was half finished, and the most skillful of the Honourable Corporation of Tanners at Liverpool could not have done better. When the sun had passed the autumn equinox, that is to say, September 23d, the winter fairly begins in the Arctic regions. The sun, having gradually sunk to the horizon, disappeared at last, October 23d, lighting up merely the tops of the mountains with its oblique rays. The doctor gave it his last farewell. He could not see it again till the month of February. Still the darkness was not complete during this long absence of the sun. The moon did its best to replace it, the stars were exceedingly brilliant, the auroras were very frequent, and the refractions peculiar to the snowy horizons. Besides, the sun at the time of its greatest southern declension, December 21st, approaches within 13 degrees of the polar horizon, hence, every day there was a certain twilight for a few hours. Only the mist and snowstorms often plunged these regions in the deepest obscurity. Still, up to this time the weather was very favourable. The partridges and hares alone had reason to complain, for the hunters gave them no rest. A great many traps were set for foxes, but these crafty animals could not be caught. Very often they scraped the snow away beneath the trap and took the bait without running any risk. The doctor cursed them, being very averse to making them such a present. October 25th, the thermometer fell as low as -4 degrees. A violent hurricane raged. The air was filled with thick snow, which permitted no ray of light to reach the Forward. For several hours there was some anxiety about the fate of Bell and Simpson, who had gone some distance away hunting. They did not reach the ship till the next day, having rested for a whole day wrapped up in their furs, while the hurricane swept over them and buried them under 5 feet of snow. They were nearly frozen, and the doctor found it very hard to restore their circulation. The tempest lasted 8 days without interruption. No one could set foot outside. In a single day there were variations in the temperature of 15 or 20 degrees. During this enforced leisure every one kept to himself, some sleeping, others smoking, others again talking in a low tone and stopping at the approach of Johnson or the doctor. There was no moral tie between the men of the crew. They only met at evening prayers and at Sunday services. Clifton knew perfectly well that when the 78th parallel was passed, his share of the pay would amount to £375. He thought it a good round sum, and his ambition did not go any further. His opinion was generally shared, and all looked forward to the day when they should enjoy this hardly earned fortune. Hatteras kept almost entirely out of sight. He never took part in the hunts or the walks from the ship. He took no interest in the meteorological phenomena which kept the doctor in a constant state of admiration. He lived with but a single idea. It consisted of 3 words: the North Pole. He only thought of when the Forward, free at last, should resume her bold course. In fact, the general feeling on board was one of gloom. Nothing was so sad as the sight of this captive vessel, no longer resting in its natural element, but with its shape hidden beneath thick layers of ice. It looks like nothing, it cannot stir, though made for motion. It is turned into a wooden storehouse, a sedentary dwelling, this ship which knows how to breast the wind and the storms. This anomaly, this false situation, filled their hearts with an indefinable feeling of disquiet and regret. During these idle hours the doctor arranged the notes he had taken, from which this book is made up. He was never out of spirits, and never lost his cheerfulness. Yet he was glad to see the end of the storm, and prepared to resume his hunting. November 3d, at 6 o'clock in the morning, with a temperature of -5 degrees, he set off in company with Johnson and Bell. The expanse of ice was unbroken. All the snow which had fallen so abundantly during the preceding days was hardened by the frost, and made good walking. The air was keen and piercing. The moon shone with incomparable purity, glistening on the least roughness in the ice. Their footprints glowed like an illuminated trail, and their long shadows stood out almost black against the brilliant ice. The doctor had taken Duke with him. He preferred him to the Greenland dogs to hunt game, and he was right, for they are of very little use under such circumstances, and they did not appear to possess the sacred fire of the race of the temperate zone. Duke ran along with his nose on the ground, and he often stopped on the recent marks of bears. Still, in spite of his skill, the hunters did not find even a hare in 2 hours' walking. "Has all the game felt it necessary to go south?" said the doctor, stopping at the foot of a hummock. "I should fancy it must be so, doctor," answered the carpenter. "I don't think so," said Johnson. "The hares, foxes, and bears are accustomed to this climate. I think this last storm must have driven them away, but they will come back with the south winds." "Ah, if you were to talk about reindeer and musk deer, that might be different." "And yet at Melville Island numberless animals of this sort are found," resumed the doctor. "It lies farther south, it is true, and during the winters he spent there Parry always had plenty of this magnificent game." "We have much poorer luck," answered Bell. "If we could only get enough bear's meat, we would do very well." "The difficulty is," said the doctor, "the bears seem to me very rare and very wild. They are not civilized enough to come within gunshot." "Bell is talking about the flesh of the bear," said Johnson, "but his grease is more useful than his flesh or his fur." "You are right, Johnson," answered Bell. "You are always thinking of the fuel." "How can I help it? Even with the strictest economy, we have only enough for 3 weeks. "Yes," resumed the doctor, "that is the real danger, for we are now only at the beginning of November, and February is the coldest month in the frigid zone. Still, if we can't get bear's grease, there's no lack of seal's grease." "But not for a very long time, doctor," answered Johnson. "They will soon leave us, whether from cold or fright. Soon they won't come upon the ice any more." "Then," continued the doctor, "we shall have to fall back on the bear, and I confess the bear is the most useful animal to be found in these countries, for he furnishes food, clothing, light, and fuel to men. Do you hear, Duke?" he said, patting the dog's head. "We want some bears, my friend, bears. Bears!" Duke, who was sniffing at the ice at that time, aroused by the voices and caresses of the doctor, started off suddenly with the speed of an arrow. He barked violently and, far off as he was, his loud barks reached the hunter's ears. The extreme distance to which sound is carried when the temperature is low is an astonishing fact. It is only equaled by the brilliancy of the constellations in the northern skies. The waves of light and sound are transmitted to great distances, especially in the dry cold of the nights. The hunters, guided by his distant barking, hastened after him. They had to run a mile, and they got there all out of breath, which happens very soon in such an atmosphere. Duke stood pointing about 50 feet from an enormous mass which was rolling about on the top of a small iceberg. "Just what we wanted," shouted the doctor, cocking his gun. "A fine bear," said Bell, following the doctor's example. "A curious bear," said Johnson, who intended to fire after his companions. Duke barked furiously. Bell advanced about 20 feet and fired, but the animal seemed untouched, for he continued rolling his head slowly. Johnson came forward, and, after taking careful aim, he pulled the trigger. "Good," said the doctor, "nothing yet. Ah, this cursed refraction! We are too far off, we shall never get used to it. That bear is more than a mile away." "Come on," answered Bell. The 3 companions hastened toward the animal, which had not been alarmed by the firing. He seemed to be very large, but, without weighing the danger, they gave themselves up already to the joy of victory. Having got within a reasonable distance, they fired. The bear leaped into the air and fell, mortally wounded, on the level ice below. Duke rushed towards him. "That's a bear," said the doctor, which was easily conquered. "Only 3 shots," said Bell with some scorn, "and he's down." "That's odd," remarked Johnson. "Unless we got here just as he was going to die of old age," continued the doctor, laughing. "Well, young or old," added Bell, here's a good capture." Talking in this way, they reached the small iceberg, and, to their great surprise, they found Duke growling over the body of a white fox. "Upon my word," said Bell, "that's too much." "Well," said the doctor, "we fired at a bear and killed a fox." Johnson did not know what to say. "Well," said the doctor with a burst of laughter in which there was a trace of disappointment, "that refraction again. It's always deceiving us." "What do you mean, doctor?" asked the carpenter. "Yes, my friend, it deceived us with respect to its size as well as the distance. It made us see a bear in a fox's skin. Such a mistake is not uncommon under similar circumstances. Well, our imagination alone was wrong." "At any rate," answered Johnson, "bear or fox, he's good eating. Let's carry him off." But as the boatswain was lifting him to his shoulders, "That's odd," he said. "What is it?" asked the doctor. "See there, doctor, he's got a collar around his neck." "A collar?" asked the doctor again, examining the fox. In fact, a half-worn-out copper collar appeared under his white fur. The doctor thought he saw letters engraved upon it. He unfastened it from the animal's neck, about which it seemed to have been for a long time. "What does that mean?" asked Johnson. "That means," said the doctor, "that we have just killed a fox more than 12 years old, a fox who was caught by James Ross in 1848. "Is it possible?" said Bell. "There's no doubt about it. I'm sorry we killed him." While he was in winter quarters, James Ross thought of trapping a large number of white foxes. He fastened on their necks copper collars on which was engraved the position of his ships, the Enterprise and Investigator, as well as where the supplies were left. These animals run over immense distances in search of food, and James Ross hoped that one of them might fall into the hands of one of the men of the Franklin expedition. That's the simple explanation, and this poor beast, who might have saved the life of 2 crews, has fallen uselessly beneath our guns. "Well, we won't eat it," said Johnson, "especially if it's 12 years old. But we shall keep the skin as a memento." Johnson raised it to his shoulders. The hunters made their way to the ship, guiding themselves by the stars. Their expedition was not wholly without result. They were able to bring back several ptarmigans. An hour before reaching the Forward, there was a singular phenomenon which greatly interested the doctor. It was a real shower of shooting stars. They could be counted by thousands, flying over the heavens like rockets. They dimmed the light of the moon. For hours they could have stood gazing at this beautiful sight. A similar phenomenon was observed in Greenland in 1799 by the Moravians. It looked like an exhibition of fireworks. The doctor, after his return to the ship, spent the whole night gazing at the sight, which lasted till 7 o'clock in the morning, while the air was perfectly silent. Chapter 26. The last piece of coal. The bears, it seemed, could not be caught. A few seals were killed on the 4th, 5th, and 6th of November, and the wind shifted and the weather grew much milder, but the snowdrifts began again with incomparable severity. It became impossible to leave the ship, and it was hard to subdue the dampness. At the end of the week the condensers contained several bushels of ice. The weather changed again November 15th, and the thermometer, under the influence of certain atmospheric conditions, sank to -24 degrees. That was the lowest temperature they had yet observed. This cold would have been endurable in calm weather, but the wind was blowing at that time, and it seemed as if the air was filled with sharp needles. The doctor regretted his captivity, for the snow was hardened by the wind, so as to make good walking, and he might have gone very far from the ship. Still, it should be said that the slightest exercise in so low a temperature is very exhausting. A man can perform hardly more than a quarter of his usual work. Iron utensils cannot be touched. If the hand seizes them, it feels as if it were burned, and shreds of skin cleave to the object which had been incautiously seized. The crew, being confined to the ship, were obliged to walk on the covered deck for 2 hours a day, where they had leave to smoke, which was forbidden in the common room. There, when the fire got low, the ice used to cover the walls and the intervals between the planks. Every nail and bolt and piece of metal was immediately covered with a film of ice. The celerity of its formation astonished the doctor. The breath of the men condensed in the air, and, changing from a fluid to a solid form, it fell about them in the form of snow. A few feet from the stove it was very cold, and the men stood grouped around the fire. Still, the doctor advised them to harden themselves, and to accustom themselves to the cold, which was not so severe as what yet awaited them. He advised them to expose their skin gradually to this intense temperature, and he himself set the example, but idleness or numbness nailed most of them to their place. They refused to stir, and preferred sleeping in that unhealthy heat. Yet, according to the doctor, there was no danger in exposing oneself to great cold after leaving a heated room. These sudden changes only inconvenience those who are in a perspiration. The doctor quoted examples in support of his opinion, but his lessons were for the most part thrown away. As for John Hatteras, he did not seem to mind the inclement cold. He walked to and fro silently, never faster or slower. Did not the cold affect his powerful frame? Did he possess to a very great degree the principle of natural heat which he wanted his men to possess? Was he so bound up in his meditations that he was indifferent to outside impressions? His men saw him with great astonishment braving a temperature of -24°. He would leave the ship for hours, and come back without appearing to suffer from the cold. "He's a singular man," said the doctor to Johnson. "He astonishes me. He carries a glowing furnace within him. He is one of the strongest natures I ever saw." "The fact is," answered Johnson, "he goes and comes and circulates in the open air, without dressing any more thickly than in the month of June." "Oh, it doesn't make much difference what one wears," answered the doctor. "What is the use of dressing warmly if one can't produce heat within himself? It's like trying to heat ice by wrapping it up in wool. But Hatteras doesn't need it, he's built that way, and I should not be surprised if his side was as warm as the neighborhood of a glowing coal." Johnson, who was charged with clearing away the waterhole every morning, noticed that the ice was 10 feet thick. Almost every night the doctor could observe the magnificent auroras. From 4 o'clock till 8 of the evening, the sky in the north was slightly lighted up, then this took a regular shape, with a rim of light yellow, the ends of which seemed to touch the field of ice. Gradually the brilliancy arose in the heavens, following the magnetic meridian, and appeared striped with black bands. Jets of luminosity shot with varying brightness here and there. When it reached the zenith it was often composed of several arcs bathed in waves of red, yellow, or green light. It was a dazzling sight. Soon the different curves met in a single point, and formed crowns of celestial richness. Finally the arcs all crowded together, the splendid aurora grew dim, the intense colors faded away into pale, vague, uncertain tints, and this wonderful phenomenon vanished gradually, insensibly, in the dark clouds of the south. It is difficult to realize the wonderful, magical beauty of such a spectacle in high latitudes, less than 8 degrees from the pole. The auroras which are seen in the temperate zone give no idea of it. It seems as if Providence wished to reserve the greatest wonders for these regions. Numerous mock moons appeared also while the moon was shining, and a great many would appear in the sky, adding to the general brilliancy. Often, too, simple lunar halos surrounded the moon with a circle of splendid luster. November 26 the tide rose very high, and the water came through the hole with great violence. The thick crust of ice seemed pushed up by the force of the sea, and the frequent cracking of the ice proclaimed the conflict that was going on beneath. Fortunately the ship remained firm in her bed, but her chains worked noisily. It was as a precaution against just such an event that Hatteras had made the brig fast. The following days were still colder. A dense fog hid the sky, the wind tossed the snow about. It was hard to determine whether it came from the clouds or from the ice fields. Everything was in confusion. The crew kept busy with various interior occupations, the principal one being the preparation of the grease and oil from the seal. It was frozen into blocks of ice, which had to be cut with a hatchet. It was broken into small fragments, which were as hard as marble. 10 barrels full were collected. As may be seen, every vessel became nearly useless, besides the risk of its breaking when the contents froze. The 28th the thermometer fell to -32 degrees. There was only 10 days' coal on board, and every one awaited with horror the moment when it should come to an end. Hatteras, for the sake of economy, had the fire in the stove in the after-room put out, and from that time Shandon, the doctor, and he were compelled to betake themselves to the common room of the crew. Hatteras was hence brought into constant communication with his men, who gazed at him with surly, dejected glances. He heard their fault-finding, their reproaches, even their threats, without being able to punish them. However, he seemed deaf to every remark. He never went near the fire. He remained in a corner, with folded arms, without saying a word. In spite of the doctor's recommendations, Penn and his friends refused to take the slightest exercise. They passed whole days crouching about the stove or under their bedclothes, hence their health began to suffer. They could not react against the rigor of the climate, and scurvy soon made its appearance on board. The doctor had long since begun to distribute, every morning, lemon juice and lime pastilles, but these precautions, which were generally so efficacious, did very little good to the sick, and the disease, following its usual course, soon showed its most horrible symptoms. Terrible indeed it was to see those wretches with their nerves and muscles contracted with pain. Their legs were fearfully swollen, and were covered with large bluish-black patches. Their bleeding gums, their swollen lips, permitted them to utter only inarticulate sounds. Their blood was poisoned, deprived of fibrine, and no longer carried life to the extremities. Clifton was the first to be attacked by this cruel malady. Soon Gripper, Brunton, and Strong had to keep to their hammocks. Those whom the illness spared could not avoid the sight of the sufferings of their friends. The common room was the only place where they could stay, so it was soon transformed into a hospital, for of the 18 sailors of the Forward, 13 were soon down with scurvy. It seemed as if Penn would escape the contagion. His strong constitution preserved him. Shandon felt the first symptoms, but it went no further with him, and plenty of exercise soon restored him to good health. The doctor tended his patients with the greatest devotion, and his heart would bleed at the sight of the sufferings he could not assuage. Still, he inspired as much cheerfulness as he could in the lonely crew. His words, his consolations, his philosophical reflections, his fortunate inventions, broke the monotony of those long days of suffering. He would read aloud to them. His wonderful memory kept him supplied with amusing anecdotes, while the men who were well stood pressing closely around the stove. But the groans of the sick, their complaints, and their cries of despair would continually interrupt him, and, breaking off in the middle of a story, he would become the devoted and attentive physician. Besides, his health remained good. He did not grow thin. His corpulence stood him in better stead than the thickest raiment, and he used to say he was as well clad as a seal or a whale, who, thanks to their thick layers of fat, easily support the rigors of the winter. Hatteras did not suffer physically or morally. The sufferings of the crew did not seem to depress him. Perhaps he would not let his emotions appear on his face, while an acute observer would have detected the heart of a man beneath this mask of iron. The doctor analyzed him, studied him, and could not classify this strange organization, this unnatural temperament. The thermometer fell still lower. The deck was entirely deserted. The Eskimos' dogs alone walked up and down it, barking dismally. There was always a man on guard near the stove, who superintended putting on the coal. It was important not to let it go out. When the fire got low, the cold crept into the room, formed on the walls, and the moisture suddenly condensed and fell in the form of snow on the unfortunate occupants of the brig. It was among these terrible sufferings that they reached December 8th. That morning the doctor went as usual to look at the thermometer. He found the mercury entirely frozen in the bulb. 44 degrees below zero, he said with terror. And on that day the last piece of coal on board was thrown into the stove. Chapter 27. The Great Cold at Christmas. For a moment he had a feeling of despair. The thought of death, and death by cold, appeared in all its horror. This last piece of coal burned with an ominous splutter. The fire seemed about to go out, and the temperature of the room fell noticeably. But Johnson went to get some of the new fuel which the marine animals had furnished to them, and with it he filled the stove. He added to it some tow filled with frozen oil, and soon obtained sufficient heat. The odor was almost unendurable, but how get rid of it? They had to get used to it. Johnson agreed that his plan was defective, and that it would not be considered a success in Liverpool. And yet, he added, this unpleasant smell will, perhaps, produce good results. What are they? Asked the carpenter. It will doubtless attract the bears this way, for they are fond of the smell. Well, continued Bell, what is the need of having bears? Bell, replied Johnson, we can't count on seals any longer. They're gone away, and for a long time. If bears don't come in their place to supply us with their share of fuel, I don't know what is to become of us. True, Johnson, our fate is very uncertain. Our position is a most alarming one. And if this sort of fuel gives out, I don't see how. There might be another. Another? Asked Bell. Yes, Bell. in despair on account of "but the captain would never, but yet we shall perhaps have to come to it." And Johnson shook his head sadly, and fell to thinking gloomily. Bell did not interrupt him. He knew that the supply of fat, which it had been so hard to acquire, would only last a week, even with the strictest economy. The boatswain was right. A great many bears, attracted by the scent, were seen to leeward of the Forward. The healthy men gave chase, but these animals are very swift of foot, and crafty enough to escape most stratagems. It was impossible to get near them, and the most skillful gunners could not hit them. The crew of the brig was in great danger of dying from the cold. It could not withstand, for 48 hours, such a temperature as would exist in the common room. Everyone looked forward with terror to getting to the end of the fuel. Now this happened December 20th, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The fire went out. The sailors, grouped about the empty stove, gazed at one another with haggard eyes. Hatteras remained without moving in his corner. The doctor, as usual, paced up and down excitedly. He did not know what was to be done. The temperature in the room fell at once to 7. But if the doctor was baffled and did not know what they should turn their hands to, others knew very well. So Shandon, cold and resolute, Penn, with wrath in his eyes, and 2 or 3 of his companions, such as he could induce to accompany him, walked towards Hatteras. "Captain," said Shandon. Hatteras, absorbed in his thoughts, did not hear him. "Captain," repeated Shandon, touching him with his hand. Hatteras arose. "Sir," he said. "Captain, the fire is out." "Well," continued Hatteras, "if you intend that we shall freeze to death," Shandon went on with grim irony, "we should be glad if you would tell us." "My intention," answered Hatteras with a deep voice, "is that every man shall do his duty to the end." "There's something superior to duty, Captain," answered his first officer, "and that is the right of self-preservation. I repeat it, we have no fire, and if this goes on, in 2 days not one of us will be alive." "I have no wood," answered Hatteras, gloomily. "Well," shouted Penn, violently, "when the wood gives out, we must go cut it where it grows." Hatteras grew pale with anger. "Where is that?" he asked. "On board," answered the sailor, insolently. "On board," repeated the captain, with clenched fists and sparkling eyes. "Of course," answered Penn, "when the ship can't carry the crew, the ship ought to be burned." At the beginning of this sentence Hatteras had grasped an axe. At its end, this axe was raised above Penn's head. "Wretch!" he cried. The doctor sprang in front of Penn, and thrust him back. The axe fell on the floor, making a deep gash. Johnson, Bell, and Simpson gathered around Hatteras, and seemed determined to support him. But plaintive, grievous cries arose from the berths, transformed into deathbeds. "Fire! Fire!" they cried, shivering beneath their now insufficient covering. Hatteras by a violent effort controlled himself, and after a few moments of silence, he said calmly, "If we destroy the ship, how shall we get back to England?" "Sir," answered Johnson, "perhaps we can without doing any material damage burn the less important parts, the bulwarks, the nettings." "The small boats will be left," said Shandon, "and besides, why might we not make a smaller vessel out of what is left of the old one?" "Never," answered Hatteras. But interposed many of the men, shouting together. "We have a large quantity of spirits of wine," suggested Hatteras, "burn all of that." "All right, we'll take the spirits of wine," answered Johnson, assuming an air of confidence which he was far from feeling. And with the aid of long wicks, dipped into this liquid of which the pale flame licked the walls of the stove, he was able to raise the temperature of the room a few degrees. In the following days the wind came from the south again and the thermometer rose. The snow, however, kept falling. Some of the men were able to leave the ship for the driest hours of the day, but ophthalmia and scurvy kept most of them on board. Besides, neither hunting nor fishing was possible. But this was only a respite in the fearful severity of the cold, and on the 25th, after a sudden change of wind, the frozen mercury disappeared again in the bulb of the instrument. Then they had to consult the spirit thermometer, which does not freeze even in the most intense colds. The doctor, to his great surprise, found it marking -66 degrees. Seldom has man been called upon to endure so low a temperature. The ice stretched in long, dark lines upon the floor, a dense mist filled the room, the dampness fell in the form of thick snow, the men could not see one another, their extremities grew cold and blue, their heads felt as if they wore an iron band, and their thoughts grew confused and dull, as if they were half delirious. A terrible symptom was that their tongues refused to articulate a sound. From the day the men threatened to burn the ship, Hatteras would walk for hours upon the deck, keeping watch. This wood was flesh and blood to him. Cutting a piece from it would have been like cutting off a limb. He was armed, and he kept constant guard, without minding the cold, the snow, or the ice, which stiffened his clothing as if it covered it with a granite cuirass. Duke understood him, and followed him, barking and howling. Nevertheless, December 25th he went down into the common room. The doctor, with all the energy he had left, went up to him and said, "Hatteras, we are going to die from want of fire." "Never," said Hatteras, knowing very well what request he was refusing. "We must," continued the doctor, mildly. "Never," repeated Hatteras more firmly, "I shall never give my consent. Whoever wishes, may disobey me." Thus was permission given them. Johnson and Bell hastened to the deck. Hatteras heard the wood of the brig crashing under the axe, and wept. That was Christmas Day, the great family festival in England, one specially devoted to the amusement of the children. What a painful recollection was that of the happy children gathered about the green Christmas tree. Every one recalled the huge pieces of roast meat, cut from the fattened ox, and the tarts, the mince pies, and other luxuries so dear to the English heart. But here was nothing but suffering, despair, and wretchedness, and for the Christmas log, these pieces of a ship lost in the middle of the frigid zone. Nevertheless, under the genial influence of the fire, the spirits and strength of the men returned, the hot tea and coffee brought great and immediate consolation, and hope is so firm a friend of man, that they even began to hope for some luckier fate. It was thus that the year 1860 passed away, the early winter of which had so interfered with Hatteras's plans. Now it happened that this very New Year's Day was marked by an unexpected discovery. It was a little milder than the previous days had been. The doctor had resumed his studies. He was reading Sir Edward Belcher's account of his expedition in the polar regions. Suddenly, a passage which he had never noticed before filled him with astonishment. He read it over again. Doubt was no longer possible. Sir Edward Belcher states that, having come to the end of Queen's Channel, he found there many traces of the presence of men. He says, "There are remains of dwellings far superior to what can be attributed to the savage habits of the wandering tribes of Eskimos. The walls are firmly placed on deep-dug foundations, the inside, covered with a thick layer of gravel, has been paved. Skeletons of moose, reindeer, and seals abound. We found coal there." At these last words an idea occurred to the doctor. He took his book and ran to tell Hatteras. "Coal," shouted the captain. "Yes, Hatteras, coal, that is to say, our preservation." "Coal, on this lonely shore," continued Hatteras. "No, that's impossible." "How can you doubt it, Hatteras?" Belcher would not have mentioned it if he had not been sure, without having seen it with his own eyes. "Well, what then, doctor?" "We are not 100 miles from the place where Belcher saw this coal." "What is a journey of 100 miles?" "Nothing. Longer expeditions have often been made on the ice, and with the cold as intense." "Let us go after it, Captain." "We'll go," said Hatteras, who had made up his mind quickly, and with his active imagination he saw the chance of safety. Johnson was informed of the plan, of which he approved highly. He told his companions, some rejoiced, others heard of it with indifference. "Coal on these shores," said Wall from his sick bed. "We'll let them go," answered Shandon, mysteriously. But before they had begun to make preparations for the trip, Hatteras wanted to fix the position of the Forward with the utmost exactitude. The importance of this calculation it is easy to see. Once away from the ship, it could not be found again without knowing its position precisely. So Hatteras went up on deck. He took observations at different moments of several lunar distances, and the altitude of the principal stars. He found, however, much difficulty in doing this, for when the temperature was so low, the glass and the mirrors of the instrument were covered with a crust of ice from Hatteras's breath. More than once his eyelids were burned by touching the copper eyepieces. Still, he was able to get very exact bases for his calculations, and he returned to the common room to work them out. When he had finished, he raised his head with stupefaction, took his chart, marked it, and looked at the doctor. "Well," asked the latter, "what was our latitude when we went into winter quarters?" "Our latitude was 78 degrees and 15 minutes, and the longitude 95 degrees and 35 minutes, exactly the pole of cold." "Well," added Hatteras in a low voice, "our ice field is drifting. We are 2 degrees farther north and farther west, at least 300 miles from your coal supply." "And these poor men who know nothing about it," cried the doctor. "Not a word," said Hatteras, raising his finger to his lips. Chapter 28. Preparations for departure. Hatteras did not wish to let his crew know about this new condition of affairs. He was right. If they had known that they were being driven towards the north with irresistible force, they would have given way to despair. The doctor knew this, and approved of the captain's silence. Hatteras had kept to himself the impressions which this discovery had caused within him. It was his first moment of joy during these long months of struggle with the hostile elements. He was 150 miles farther north, hardly 8 degrees from the pole. But he hid his joy so well that the doctor did not even suspect it. He asked himself why Hatteras's eyes shone with so unusual a luster, but that was all, and the natural reply to this question did not enter his head. The Forward, as it approached the pole, had drifted away from the coal which had been seen by Sir Edward Belcher. Instead of 100 miles, it would have to be sought 250 miles farther south. Still, after a short discussion between Hatteras and Clawbonny, they determined to make the attempt. If Belcher was right, and his accuracy could not be doubted, they would find everything just as he had left it. Since 1853, no new expedition had visited these remote continents. Few, if any, Eskimos are found in this latitude. The disaster which had befallen at Beechey Island could not be repeated on the shores of North Cornwall. Everything seemed to favor an excursion across the ice. They estimated that they would be gone 40 days at the outside, and preparations were made by Johnson for that time of absence. In the first place, he saw about the sledge. It was of the shape of those used in Greenland, 35 inches broad and 24 feet long. The Eskimos sometimes make them 50 feet long. It was built of long planks, bent at each end, and kept in position by 2 strong cords. This shape adapted it to resist violent shocks. The sledge ran easily upon the ice, but before the snow had hardened, it was necessary to place 2 vertical frames near together, and being raised in this way, it could run on without cutting too much into the snow. Besides, by rubbing it with a mixture of sulfur and snow in the Eskimos' fashion, it ran very easily. It was drawn by 6 dogs. They were strong in spite of their thinness, and did not appear to be injured by the severity of the winter. The harnesses of deerskin were in good condition. Perfect reliance could be placed on the equipment, which the Greenlanders at Upernavik had sold in conscience. These 6 animals alone could draw a weight of 2,000 pounds without inordinate fatigue. They carried with them a tent, in case it should be impossible to build a snow house, a large sheet of mackintosh to spread over the snow, so that it should not melt at contact with their bodies, and, last of all, many coverings of wool and buffalo skin. In addition, they carried the Hawkett boat. Their provisions consisted of 5 chests of pemmican, weighing 450 pounds. A pound of pemmican was allotted for each man and dog. Of the latter there were 7, including Duke. There were to be 4 men. They carried, besides, 12 gallons of spirits of wine, weighing nearly 150 pounds, tea and biscuit, in proper amounts, a little portable kitchen, with a great many wicks, and much tow, ammunition, and 4 double-barreled guns. The men of the party made use of Captain Parry's invention, and wore girdles of india-rubber in which the heat of the body and the motion in walking could keep tea, coffee, and water in a liquid state. Johnson took special care of the preparation of snowshoes. With their wooden frames and leathern straps, they served as skates. On thoroughly frozen spots, deerskin moccasins could be worn with comfort. Every man carried 2 pairs of each. These preparations, which were so important because the omission of a single detail might have caused the ruin of the whole expedition, required 4 whole days. Every day at noon Hatteras took an observation of the ship's position. It was no longer drifting, and this had to be perfectly sure in order to secure their return. Hatteras undertook to choose the 4 men who were to accompany him. It was not an easy decision to take, some it was not advisable to take, but then the question of leaving them on board had also to be considered. Still, the common safety demanded the success of this trip, and the captain deemed it right to choose sure and experienced men. Hence Shandon was left out, but not much to his regret. James Wall was too ill to go. The sick grew no worse. Their treatment consisted of repeated rubbing and strong doses of lemon juice. This was easily seen to without the presence of the doctor being essential. Hence he enrolled himself among those who should go, and no voice was raised against it. Johnson would have gladly gone with the captain in his dangerous expedition, but Hatteras drew him to one side and said to him in an affectionate, almost weeping voice, "Johnson, you are the only man I can trust. You are the only officer with whom I can leave the ship. I must know that you are here to keep an eye on Shandon and the others. They are kept to the ship by the winter, but who can say what plans they are not capable of forming? You shall receive my formal instructions, which shall place the command in your hands. You shall take my place. We shall be absent for 5 weeks at the most, and I shall be at ease having you here where I cannot be. You need wood, Johnson. I know it. But as much as possible, spare my ship. Do you understand, Johnson?" "I understand, Captain," answered the old sailor, "and I will remain if you prefer it." "Thanks," said Hatteras, pressing the boatswain's hand, and he added, "In case we don't come back, Johnson, wait till the next thaw, and try to push on to the pole. If the rest refuse, don't think of us, but take the Forward back to England." "That is your wish, Captain?" "It is," answered Hatteras. "Your orders shall be obeyed," said Johnson, quietly. The doctor regretted that his friend was not going to accompany him, but he was obliged to recognize the wisdom of Hatteras's plan. His 2 other companions were Bell the carpenter and Simpson. The first, who was sturdy, brave, and devoted, would be of great service in their camping in the snow. The other, although less resolute, nevertheless determined to take part in this expedition in which he might be of use as hunter and fisher. So this detachment consisted of Hatteras, Clawbonny, Bell, Simpson, and the faithful Duke, making in all 4 men and 7 dogs to be fed. A suitable amount of provisions was made ready. During the early days of January the mean temperature was -33 degrees. Hatteras waited impatiently for milder weather. He frequently consulted the barometer, but no confidence could be placed in this instrument, which in these high latitudes seems to lose some of its customary accuracy. In these regions there are many exceptions to the general laws of nature. For instance, a clear sky was not always accompanied by cold, nor did a fall of snow raise the temperature. The barometer was uncertain. As many explorers in these seas have noticed, it used to fall when the wind was from the north or east, when low it foretold fine weather, when high, rain or snow. Hence its indications could hardly be relied on. Finally, January 5th an easterly breeze brought with it a rise in the thermometer of 15 degrees, so that it stood at -18 degrees. Hatteras resolved to start the next day. He could no longer endure seeing his ship torn to pieces before his eyes. The whole quarterdeck had been burned up. So, January 6th, amid squalls of snow, the order to depart was given. The doctor gave his last words of advice to the sick. Bell and Simpson shook hands silently with their companions. Hatteras wanted to make a farewell speech to the men, but he saw nothing but angry faces around him. He fancied he saw an ironical smile playing about Shandon's lips. He held his peace. Perhaps he had a momentary pang at parting as he gazed at the Forward. But it was too late for him to change his mind. The sledge, loaded and harnessed, was waiting on the ice. Bell was the first to move, the others followed. Johnson accompanied the travelers for 1/4 of a mile, then Hatteras asked him to return, which he did after a long leave-taking. At that moment, Hatteras, turning for the last time towards the brig, saw the tops of her masts disappearing in the dark snow clouds. Chapter 29. Across the ice fields. The little band made their way towards the southeast. Simpson drove the sledge. Duke aided him much, without being disturbed at the occupation of his mates. Hatteras and the doctor followed behind on foot, while Bell, who was charged with making a road, went on in advance, testing the ice with the iron point of his stick. The rise in the thermometer foretold a fall of snow, and soon it came, beginning in large flakes. This added to the hardships of their journey. They kept straying from a straight line. They could not go quickly. Nevertheless, they averaged 3 miles an hour. The ice field, under the pressure of the frost, presented an unequal surface. The sledge was often nearly turned over, but they succeeded in saving it. Hatteras and his companions wrapped themselves up in their fur clothes cut in the Greenland fashion. They were not cut with extraordinary neatness, but they suited the needs of the climate. Their faces were enclosed in a narrow hood which could not be penetrated by the snow or wind. Their mouths, noses, and eyes were alone exposed to the air, and they did not need to be protected against it. Nothing is so inconvenient as scarves and nose protectors, which soon are stiff with ice at night. They have to be cut away, which, even in the Arctic seas, is a poor way of undressing. It was necessary to leave free passage for the breath, which would freeze at once on anything it met. The boundless plain stretched out with tiresome monotony. Everywhere there appeared heaped-up ice hills, hummocks, blocks, and icebergs, separated by winding valleys. They walked staff in hand, saying but little. In this cold atmosphere, to open the mouth was painful. Sharp crystals of ice suddenly formed between the lips, and the heat of the breath could not melt them. Their progress was silent, and every one beat the ice with his staff. Bell's footsteps were visible in the fresh snow. They followed them mechanically, and where he had passed, the others could go safely. Numerous tracks of bears and foxes crossed one another everywhere, but during this first day not one could be seen. To chase them would have been dangerous and useless. They would only have overloaded the already heavy sledge. Generally, in excursions of this sort, travelers take the precaution of leaving supplies along their path. They hide them from the animals in the snow, thus lightening themselves for their trip, and on their return they take the supplies which they did not have the trouble of carrying with them. Hatteras could not employ this device on an ice field which perhaps was moving. On firm land it would have been possible, and the uncertainty of their route made it doubtful whether they would return by the same path. At noon, Hatteras halted his little troop in the shelter of an ice wall. They dined off pemmican and hot tea. The strengthening qualities of this beverage produced general comfort, and the travelers drank a large quantity. After an hour's rest they started on again. In the first day they walked about 20 miles. That evening men and dogs were tired out. Still, in spite of their fatigue, they had to build a snow house in which to pass the night. The tent would not have been enough. This took them an hour and a half. Bell was very skillful. The blocks of ice, which were cut with a knife, were placed on top of one another with astonishing rapidity, and they took the shape of a dome, and a last piece, the keystone of the arch, established the solidity of the building. The soft snow served as mortar in the interstices. It soon hardened and made the whole building of a single piece. Access was had into this improvised grotto by means of a narrow opening, through which it was necessary to crawl on one's hands and knees. The doctor found some difficulty in entering, and the others followed. Supper was soon prepared on the alcohol cooking stove. The temperature inside was very comfortable. The wind, which was raging without, could not get in. "Sit down," soon shouted the doctor in his most genial manner. And this meal, though the same as the dinner, was shared by all. When it was finished their only thought was sleep. The mackintoshes, spread out upon the snow, protected them from the dampness. At the flame of the portable stove they dried their clothes. Then 3 of them, wrapped up in their woolen coverings, fell asleep, while one was left on watch. He had to keep a lookout on the safety of all, and to prevent the opening from being closed, otherwise they ran a risk of being buried alive. Duke shared their quarters. The other dogs remained without, and after they had eaten their supper they lay down and were soon hidden by the snow. Their fatigue soon brought sound sleep. The doctor took the watch until 3 of the morning. In the night the hurricane raged furiously. Strange was the situation of these lonely men lost in the snow, enclosed in this vault with its walls rapidly thickening under the snowfall. The next morning at 6 o'clock their monotonous march was resumed. There were ever before them the same valleys and icebergs, a uniformity which made the choice of a path difficult. Still, a fall of several degrees in the temperature made their way easier by hardening the snow. Often they came across little elevations, which looked like cairns or storing places of the Eskimos. The doctor had one destroyed to satisfy his curiosity, but he found nothing except a cake of ice. "What do you expect to find, Clawbonny?" asked Hatteras. "Are we not the first men to penetrate into this part of the globe?" "Probably," answered the doctor, "but who knows? "Don't let us waste our time in useless searching," resumed the captain. "I am in a hurry to rejoin the ship, even if this long-wanted fuel should not be found." "I have great hopes of finding it," said the doctor. "Doctor," Hatteras used to say frequently, "I did wrong to leave the Forward. It was a mistake. The captain's place is on board, and nowhere else. Johnson is there." "Yes. But let us hurry on." They advanced rapidly. Simpson's voice could be heard urging on the dogs. They ran along on a brilliant surface, all aglow with a phosphorescent light, and the runners of the sledge seemed to toss up a shower of sparks. The doctor ran on ahead to examine this snow, when suddenly, as he was trying to jump upon a hummock, he disappeared from sight. Bell, who was near him, ran at once towards the place. "Well, doctor," he cried anxiously, while Hatteras and Simpson joined him, "where are you?" "Doctor," shouted the captain. "Down here, at the bottom of a hole," was the quiet answer. "Throw me a piece of rope, and I'll come up to the surface of the globe." They threw a rope down to the doctor, who was at the bottom of a pit about 10 feet deep. He fastened it about his waist, and his 3 companions drew him up with some difficulty. "Are you hurt?" asked Hatteras. "No, there's no harm done," answered the doctor, wiping the snow from his smiling face. "But how did it happen?" "Oh, it was in consequence of the refraction," he answered, laughing. "I thought I had about a foot to step over, and I fell into this deep hole. These optical illusions are the only ones left me, my friends, and it's hard to escape from them. Let that be a lesson to us all never to take a step forward without first testing the ice with a staff, for our senses cannot be depended on. Here our ears hear wrong, and our eyes deceive us. It's a curious country." "Can you go on?" asked the captain. "Go on, Hatteras, go on. This little fall has done me more good than harm." They resumed their march to the southeast, and at evening they halted. After walking about 25 miles, they were all tired, but still the doctor had energy enough to ascend an ice mountain while the snow hut was building. The moon, which was nearly at its full, shone with extraordinary brilliancy in a clear sky. The stars were wonderfully brilliant. From the top of the iceberg a boundless plain could be seen, which was covered with strangely formed hillocks of ice. In the moonlight they looked like fallen columns or overthrown tombstones. The scene reminded the doctor of a huge, silent graveyard barren of trees, in which 20 generations of human beings might be lying in their long sleep. In spite of the cold and fatigue, Clawbonny remained for a long time in a reverie, from which it was no easy task for his companions to arouse him, but they had to think of resting. The snow hut was completed, the 4 travellers crawled in like moles, and soon were all asleep. The following days went on without any particular incident. At times they went on slowly, at times quickly, with varying ease, according to the changes in the weather. They wore moccasins or snowshoes, as the nature of the ice demanded. In this way they went on till January 15th. The moon, now in its last quarter, was hardly visible. The sun, although always beneath the horizon, gave a sort of twilight for 6 hours every day, but not enough to light up the route, which had to be directed by the compass. Then Bell went on ahead, Hatteras followed next. Simpson and the doctor sought also to keep in a straight line behind, with their eyes on Hatteras alone, and yet, in spite of all their efforts, they often got 30 or 40 degrees from the right way, much to their annoyance. Sunday, January 15th, Hatteras judged that they had come about 100 miles to the south. This morning was set aside to mending their clothes and materials. The reading of divine service was not forgotten. At noon they started again. The temperature was very low. The thermometer marked only -22 degrees. The air was very clear. Suddenly, without warning, a frozen vapor arose into the air from the ice, to a height of about 90 feet, and hung motionless. No one could see a foot before him. This vapor formed in long, sharp crystals upon their clothing. The travelers, surprised by this phenomenon, which is called frost rime, only thought of getting together, so immediately various shouts were heard. "Oh, Simpson! Bell, this way! Dr. Clawbonny! Doctor! Captain, where are you?" They began to look for one another with outstretched arms, wandering through the fog which their eyes could not pierce. But to their disappointment they could hear no answer. The vapor seemed incapable of carrying sound. Each one then thought of firing his gun as a signal to the others. But if their voices were too feeble, the reports of the firearms were too loud for the echoes, repeated in every direction, made but a confused roar, in which no particular direction could be perceived. Then they began to act, each one as he thought best. Hatteras stood still and folded his arms. Simpson contented himself with stopping the sledge. Bell retraced his steps, feeling them with his hand. The doctor, stumbling over the blocks of ice, wandered here and there, getting more and more bewildered. At the end of 5 minutes he said to himself, "This can't last long. Singular climate. This is too much. There is nothing to help us, without speaking of these sharp crystals which cut my face." "Halloo, Captain," he shouted again. But he heard no answer. He fired his gun, but in spite of his thick gloves the iron burned his hands. Meanwhile he thought he saw a confused mass moving near him. "There's someone," he said. "Hatteras! Bell! Simpson! Is that you? Come, answer!" A dull roar was alone heard. "Ah," thought the doctor, "what is that?" The object approached, it lost its first size and appeared in more definite shape. A terrible thought flashed into the doctor's mind. "A bear," he said to himself. In fact, it was a huge bear, lost in the fog. It came and went with great danger to the men, whose presence it certainly did not suspect. "Matters are growing complicated," thought the doctor, standing still. Sometimes he felt the animal's breath, which was soon lost in the frost rime. Again he would see the monster's huge paws beating the air so near him that his clothes were occasionally torn by its sharp claws. He jumped back, and the animal disappeared like a phantasmagoric spectre. But as he sprang back he found an elevation beneath his feet. He climbed up first one block of ice, then another, feeling his way with his staff. "An iceberg," he said to himself, "if I can get to the top I am safe." With these words he climbed up an elevation of about 90 feet with surprising agility. He arose above the frozen mist, the top of which was sharply defined. "Good," he said to himself, and looking about him he saw his 3 companions emerging from the vapor. Hatteras! Dr. Clawbonny! Bell! Simpson! These names were shouted out almost at the same time. The sky, lit up by a magnificent halo, sent forth pale rays which colored the frost rime as if it were a cloud, and the top of the iceberg seemed to rise from a mass of molten silver. The travelers found themselves within a circle of less than 100 feet in diameter. Thanks to the purity of the air in this upper layer in this low temperature, their words could be easily heard, and they were able to talk on the top of this iceberg. After the first shots, each one, hearing no answer, had only thought of climbing above the mist. "The sledge," he shouted the captain. "It's 80 feet beneath us," answered Simpson. "Is it all right?" "All right." "And the bear?" asked the doctor. "What bear?" said Bell. "A bear," said Hatteras. "Let's go down." "No," said the doctor, "we shall lose our way, and have to begin it all over again." "And if he eats our dogs?" said Hatteras. At that moment Duke was heard barking, the sound rising through the mist. "That's Duke," shouted Hatteras. "There's something wrong." "I'm going down." All sorts of howling arose to their ears. Duke and the dogs were barking furiously. The noise sounded like a dull murmur, like the roar of a crowded, noisy room. They knew that some invisible struggle was going on below, and the mist was occasionally agitated like the sea when marine monsters are fighting. "Duke, Duke," shouted the captain, as he made ready to enter again into the frost rime. "Wait a moment, Hatteras, wait a moment. It seems to me that the fog is lifting." It was not lifting, but sinking, like water in a pool. It appeared to be descending into the ground from which it had risen. The summits of the icebergs grew larger. Others, which had been hidden, arose like new islands, by an optical illusion, which may be easily imagined. The travelers, clinging to these ice cones, seemed to be rising in the air, while the top of the mist sank beneath them. Soon the top of the sledge appeared, then the harnessed dogs, and then about 30 other animals, then great objects moving confusedly, and Duke leaping about with his head alternately rising and sinking in the frozen mist. "Foxes!" shouted Bell. "Bears!" said the doctor. 1, 2, 3. "Our dogs! Our provisions!" cried Simpson. A troop of foxes and bears, having come across the sledge, were ravaging the provisions. Their instinct of pillaging united them in perfect harmony. The dogs were barking furiously, but the animals paid no heed, but went on in their work of destruction. "Fire!" shouted the captain, discharging his piece. His companions did the same. But at the combined report the bears, raising their heads and uttering a singular roar, gave the signal to depart. They fell into a little trot which a galloping horse could not have kept up with, and, followed by the foxes, they soon disappeared amid the ice to the north. Chapter 30. The cairn. This phenomenon, which is peculiar to the polar regions, had lasted 3/4 of an hour. The bears and foxes had had plenty of time. These provisions arrived opportunely for these animals, who were nearly starved during the inclement weather. The canvas cover of the sledge was torn by their strong claws. The casks of pemmican were opened and emptied, the biscuit sacks pillaged, the tea spilled over the snow, a barrel of alcohol torn open and its contents lost. Their camping materials scattered and damaged bore witness to the ferocity of these wild beasts and their greediness. "This is a misfortune," said Bell, gazing at this scene of ruin. "Which is probably irreparable," said Simpson. "Let us first estimate the loss," interrupted the doctor, "and we'll talk about it afterwards." Hatteras, without saying a word, began to gather the scattered boxes and sacks. They collected the pemmican and biscuits which could be eaten. The loss of part of their alcohol was much to be regretted, for if that was gone there would be nothing warm to drink, no tea, no coffee. In making an inventory of the supplies left, the doctor found 200 pounds of pemmican gone, and 150 pounds of biscuit. If their journey continued they would have to subsist on half rations. They then began to discuss what should be done, whether they should return to the ship and start out again. But how could they make up their minds to lose the 150 miles they had already made? To return without fuel would have a depressing effect upon the spirits of the crew. Could men be found again to resume their march across the ice? Evidently it was better to push on, even at the risk of severe privations. The doctor, Hatteras, and Bell were of this opinion. Simpson wanted to go back. The fatigue of the journey had worn upon his health. He was visibly weaker, but finding himself alone of this opinion, he resumed his place at the head of the sledge, and the little caravan continued its journey to the south. During the 3 next days, from the 15th to the 17th of January, all the monotonous incidents of the voyage were repeated. They advanced more slowly, and with much fatigue. Their legs grew tired. The dogs dragged the sledge with difficulty. Their diminished supply of food could not comfort men or beasts. The weather was very variable, changing from intense, dry cold to damp, penetrating mists. January 18th, the aspect of the ice fields changed suddenly. A great number of peaks, like sharp-pointed pyramids, and very high, appeared at the horizon. The ground in certain places came through the snow. It seemed formed of gneiss, schist, and quartz, with some appearance of limestone. The travellers at last touched earth again, and this land they judged to be that called North Cornwall. The doctor could not help striking the earth with joy. They had now only 100 miles to go before reaching Cape Belcher, but their fatigue increased strangely on this soil, covered with sharp rocks, and interspersed with dangerous points, crevasses, and precipices. They had to go down into the depths of these abysses, climb steep ascents, and cross narrow gorges, in which the snow was drifted to the depth of 30 or 40 feet. The travellers soon regretted the almost easy journey over the ice fields, which so well suited the sledge. Now it had to be dragged by main force. The weary dogs were insufficient. The men, compelled to take their place alongside of them, wore themselves out with hauling. Often they had to take off the whole load to get over some steep hills. A place only 10 feet wide often kept them busy for hours. So in this first day they made only 5 miles in North Cornwall, which is certainly well named, for it exhibits all the roughness, the sharp points, the steep gorges, the confused rockiness of the southwest coast of England. The next day the sledge reached the top of the hills near the shore. The exhausted travellers, being unable to make a snow hut, were obliged to pass the night under the tent, wrapped up in buffalo skins, and drying their wet stockings by placing them about their bodies. The inevitable consequences of such conduct are easily comprehended. That night the thermometer fell below -44 degrees, and the mercury froze. Simpson's health caused great anxiety. A persistent cough, violent rheumatism, and intolerable pain obliged him to lie on the sledge which he could no longer guide. Bell took his place. He too was suffering, but not so much as to be incapacitated. The doctor also felt the consequences of this trip in this terrible weather, but he uttered no complaint. He walked on, resting on his staff. He made out the way and helped everyone. Hatteras, impassible and as strong as on the first day, followed the sledge in silence. January 20th. The weather was so severe that the slightest effort produced complete prostration. Still, the difficulties of the way were so great that Hatteras, the doctor, and Bell harnessed themselves with the dogs. Sudden shocks had broken the front of the sledge, and they had to stop to repair it. Such delays were frequent every day. The travelers followed a deep ravine, up to their waists in snow, and perspiring violently in spite of the intense cold. They did not say a word. Suddenly Bell, who was near the doctor, looked at him with some alarm. Then, without uttering a word, he picked up a handful of snow and began rubbing his companion's face violently. "Well, Bell," said the doctor, resisting. But Bell continued rubbing. "Come, Bell," began the doctor again, his mouth, nose, and eyes full of snow. "Are you mad? What's the matter?" "If you have a nose left," answered Bell, "you ought to be grateful to me." "A nose," answered the doctor, quickly, clapping his hand to his face. "Yes, doctor, you were frostbitten. Your nose was white when I looked at you, and if I had not done as I did, you would have lost that ornament which is in the way on a journey, but agreeable to one's existence." In fact, the doctor's nose was almost frozen. The circulation of the blood was restored in time, and, thanks to Bell, all danger was gone. "Thanks, Bell," said the doctor, "I'll be even with you yet." "I hope so, doctor," the carpenter answered, "and may heaven protect us from worse misfortunes." "Alas, Bell," continued the doctor, "you mean Simpson. The poor fellow is suffering terribly." "Do you fear for his life?" asked Hatteras, quickly. "Yes, Captain," answered the doctor. "And why?" "He has a violent attack of scurvy, his legs have begun to swell, and his gums too. The poor fellow lies half frozen on the sledge, and every movement redoubles his suffering. I pity him, Hatteras, and I can't do anything to relieve him." "Poor Simpson," murmured Bell. "Perhaps we shall have to halt for a day or two," resumed the doctor. "Halt," shouted Hatteras, "when the lives of 18 men are hanging on our return." "Still," said the doctor. "Clawbonny, Bell, listen to me," said Hatteras, "we have food for only 20 days. Judge for yourselves whether we can stop for a moment." Neither the doctor nor Bell made any reply, and the sledge resumed its progress, which had been delayed for a moment. That evening they stopped beneath a hillock of ice, in which Bell at once cut a cavern. The travelers entered it. The doctor passed the night attending to Simpson. The scurvy had already made fearful ravages, and his sufferings caused perpetual laments to issue from his swollen lips. "Ah, Dr. Clawbonny!" "Courage, my dear fellow," said the doctor. "I shall never get well. I feel it. I'd rather die." The doctor answered these despairing words by incessant cares. Although worn out by the fatigue of the day, he spent the night in composing a soothing potion for his patient, but the lime juice was ineffectual, and continual friction could not keep down the progress of the scurvy. The next day he had to be placed again upon the sledge, although he besought them to leave him behind to die in peace. Then they resumed their dreary and difficult march. The frozen mists penetrated the 3 men to the bone, the snow and sleet dashed against them, they were working like draught horses, and with a scanty supply of food. Duke, like his master, kept coming and going, enduring every fatigue, always alert, finding out by himself the best path. They had perfect confidence in his wonderful instinct. During the morning of January 23d, amid almost total darkness, for the moon was new, Duke had run on ahead. For many hours he was not seen. Hatteras became uneasy, especially because there were many traces of bears to be seen. He was uncertain what to do, when suddenly a loud barking was heard. Hatteras urged on the sledge, and soon he found the faithful animal at the bottom of a ravine. Duke stood as motionless as if turned to stone, barking before a sort of cairn made of pieces of limestone, covered with a cement of ice. "This time," said the doctor, detaching his harness, "it's a cairn, there's no doubt of that." "What's that to us?" asked Hatteras. "Hatteras, if it is a cairn, it may contain some document of value for us, perhaps some provisions, and it would be worthwhile to see." What European could have come as far as this? Asked Hatteras, shrugging his shoulders. But in lack of Europeans, answered the doctor, cannot Eskimos have made it here to contain what they have fished or shot? It's their habit, I think. Well, go and look at it, continued Hatteras, but I'm afraid it will be hardly worth your while. Clawbonny and Bell walked to the cairn with picks in their hands. Duke continued barking furiously. The limestones were firmly fastened together by the ice, but a few blows scattered them on the ground. There's something there, evidently, said the doctor. I think so, answered Bell. They rapidly destroyed the cairn. Soon they found a bundle and in it a damp paper. The doctor took it with a beating heart. Hatteras ran forward, seized the paper, and read, Altum a porpoise, December 13, 1860, longitude 12, missing digit, degrees, latitude 8, missing digit, degrees and 35 minutes. The porpoise, said the doctor. The porpoise, replied Hatteras. I never heard of a ship of this name in these seas. It is clear, resumed the doctor, that travellers, perhaps shipwrecked sailors, have been here within 2 months. That is sure, said Bell. What are we going to do? Asked the doctor. Push on, answered Hatteras, coldly. I don't know anything about any ship called the Porpoise, but I know that the brig Forward is waiting for our return. Chapter 31. The Death of Simpson. They resumed their journey. The mind of every one was filled with new and unexpected ideas, for to meet anyone in these regions is about the most remarkable event that can happen. Hatteras frowned uneasily. The Porpoise, he kept saying to himself, what ship is that? And what is it doing so near the pole? At the thought, he shuddered. The doctor and Bell only thought of the 2 results which might follow the discovery of this document, that they might be of service in saving someone, or, possibly, that they might be saved by them. But the difficulties, obstacles, and dangers soon returned, and they could only think of their perilous position. Simpson's condition grew worse. The doctor could not be mistaken about the symptoms of a speedy death. He could do nothing. He was himself suffering from a painful ophthalmia, which might be accompanied by deafness if he did not take care. The twilight at that time gave light enough, and this light, reflected by the snow, was bad for the eyes. It was hard to protect them from the reflection, for glasses would be soon covered with a layer of ice which rendered them useless. Hence they had to guard carefully against accident by the way, and they had to run the risk of ophthalmia. Still, the doctor and Bell covered their eyes and took turns in guiding the sledge. It ran far from smoothly on its worn runners. It became harder and harder to drag it. Their path grew more difficult. The land was of volcanic origin, and all cut up with craters. The travellers had been compelled gradually to ascend 1,500 feet to reach the top of the mountains. The temperature was lower, the storms were more violent, and it was a sorry sight to see these poor men on these lonely peaks. They were also made sick by the whiteness of everything. The uniform brilliancy tired them, it made them giddy. The earth seemed to wave beneath their feet with no fixed point on the immense white surface. They felt as one does on shipboard when the deck seems to be giving way beneath the foot. They could not get over the impression, and the persistence of the feeling wearied their heads. Their limbs grew torpid, their minds grew dull, and often they walked like men half asleep. Then a slip or a sudden fall would rouse them for a few moments from their sluggishness. January 25 they began to descend the steep slopes, which was even more fatiguing. A false step, which it was by no means easy to avoid, might hurl them down into deep ravines where they would certainly have perished. Towards evening a violent tempest raged about the snowy summit. It was impossible to withstand the force of the hurricane. They had to lie down on the ground, but so low was the temperature that they ran a risk of being frozen to death at once. Bell, with Hatteras' aid, built with much difficulty a snow house, in which the poor men sought shelter. There they partook of a few fragments of pemmican and a little hot tea. Only 4 gallons of alcohol were left, and they had to use this to allay their thirst, for snow cannot be absorbed if taken in its natural state. It has to be melted first. In the temperate zone, where the cold hardly ever sinks much below the freezing point, it can do no harm, but beyond the polar circle it is different. It reaches so low a temperature that the bare hand can no more touch it than it can iron at a white heat, and this, although it is a very poor conductor of heat, so great is the difference of temperature between it and the stomach that its absorption produces real suffocation. The Eskimos prefer severe thirst to quenching it with this snow. which does not replace water and only augments the thirst instead of appeasing it. The only way the travelers could make use of it was by melting it over the spirit lamp. At 3 in the morning, when the tempest was at its height, the doctor took his turn at the watch. He was lying in a corner of the hut when a groan of distress from Simpson attracted his attention. He arose to see to him, but in rising he hit his head sharply against the icy roof. Without paying any attention to that, he bent over Simpson and began to rub his swollen, discolored legs. After doing this for a quarter of an hour, he started to rise and bumped his head again, although he was on his knees. "That's odd," he said to himself. He raised his hand above his head. The roof was perceptibly sinking. "Great God!" he cried. "Wake up, my friends!" At his shouts, Hatteras and Bella rose quickly, striking their heads against the roof. They were in total darkness. "We shall be crushed," said the doctor. "Let's get out." And all three, dragging Simpson after them, abandoned their dangerous quarters, and it was high time, for the blocks of ice, ill put together, fell with a loud crash. The poor men found themselves then without shelter against the hurricane. Hatteras attempted to raise the tent, but it was impossible, so severe was the wind, and they had to shelter themselves beneath the canvas, which was soon covered with a thick layer of snow, but this snow prevented the radiation of their warmth and kept them from being frozen to death. The storm lasted all night. Bell, when he was harnessing the half-starved dogs, noticed that 3 of them had begun to eat the leather straps. 2 were very sick and seemed unable to go on. Still, they set out as well as they could. They had 60 miles between them and the point they wished to reach. On the 26th, Bell, who was ahead, shouted suddenly to his companions. They ran towards him, and he pointed with astonishment to a gun resting on a piece of ice. "A gun!" cried the doctor. Hatteras took it. It was in good condition, and loaded. "The men of the Porpoise can't be far off." Hatteras, as he was examining the gun, noticed that it was of American make. His hands clenched nervously its barrel. "Forward," he said calmly. They continued to descend the mountains. Simpson seemed deprived of all feeling. He had not even strength left to moan. The tempest continued to rage. The sledge went on more and more slowly. They made but a few miles in 24 hours, and, in spite of the strictest economy, their supplies threatened to give out, but so long as enough was left to carry them back, Hatteras pushed on. On the 27th they found, partly buried beneath the snow, a sextant and then a flask, which contained brandy, or rather a piece of ice, in the middle of which all the spirit of the liquor had collected in the form of snow. It was of no use. Evidently, without meaning it, Hatteras was following in the wake of some great disaster. He went on by the only possible route, collecting the traces of some terrible shipwreck. The doctor kept a sharp lookout for other cairns, but in vain. Sad thoughts beset him. In fact, if he should discover these wretches, of what service could he be to them? He and his companions were beginning to lack everything. Their clothing was torn, their supplies were scanty. If the survivors were many, they would all starve to death. Hatteras seemed inclined to flee from them. Was he not justified, since the safety of the crew depended upon him? Ought he to endanger the safety of all by bringing strangers on board? But then strangers were men, perhaps their countrymen. Slight as was their chance of safety, ought they to be deprived of it? The doctor wanted to get Bell's opinion, but Bell refused to answer. His own sufferings had hardened his heart. Clawbonny did not dare ask Hatteras, so he sought aid from Providence. Towards the evening of that day, Simpson appeared to be failing fast. His cold, stiff limbs, his impeded breathing, which formed a mist about his head, his convulsive movements, announced that his last hour had come. His expression was terrible to behold. It was despairing, with a look of impotent rage at the captain. It contained a whole accusation, mute reproaches which were full of meaning, and perhaps deserved. Hatteras did not go near the dying man. He avoided him, more silent, more shut into himself than ever. The following night was a terrible one. The violence of the tempest was doubled. 3 times the tent was thrown over, and snow was blown over the suffering men, blinding them, and wounding them with the pieces torn from the neighboring masses. The dogs barked incessantly. Simpson was exposed to all the inclemency of the weather. Bell succeeded in again raising the canvas, which, if it did not protect them from the cold, at least kept off the snow. But a sudden squall blew it down for the fourth time and carried it away with a fierce blast. "Ah, that is too much," shouted Bell. "Courage, courage," answered the doctor, stooping down to escape being blown away. Simpson was gasping for breath. Suddenly, with a last effort, he half rose, stretched his clenched fist at Hatteras, who was gazing steadily at him, uttered a heart-rending cry, and fell back dead in the midst of his unfinished threat. "Dead," said the doctor. "Dead," repeated Bell. Hatteras, who was approaching the corpse, drew back before the violence of the wind. He was the first of the crew who succumbed to the murderous climate, the first to offer up his life, after incalculable sufferings, to the captain's persistent obstinacy. This man had considered him an assassin, but Hatteras did not quail before the accusation. But a tear, falling from his eyes, froze on his pale cheek. The doctor and Bell looked at him in terror. Supported by his long staff, he seemed like the genius of these regions, straight in the midst of the fierce blast, and terrible in his stern severity. He remained standing, without stirring, till the first rays of the twilight appeared, bold and unconquerable, and seeming to defy the tempest which was roaring about him. Chapter 32. The return to the forward. Toward 6 o'clock in the morning the wind fell, and, shifting suddenly to the north, it cleared the clouds from the sky. The thermometer stood at -33 degrees. The first rays of the twilight appeared on the horizon above which it would soon peer. Hatteras approached his two dejected companions and said to them, sadly and gently, "My friends, we are more than 60 miles from the point mentioned by Sir Edward Belcher. We have only just enough food left to take us back to the ship. To go farther would only expose us to certain death, without our being of service to anyone. We must return." "That is a wise decision, Hatteras," answered the doctor. "I should have followed you anywhere, but we are all growing weaker every day. We can hardly set one foot before the other. I approve of returning." "Is that your opinion?" Bell asked Hatteras. "Yes, Captain," answered the carpenter. "Well," continued Hatteras, "we will take 2 days for rest." "That's not too much. The sledge needs a great many repairs. I think, too, we ought to build a snow house in which we can repose." This being decided, the 3 men set to work energetically. Bell took the necessary precautions to ensure the solidity of the building, and soon a satisfactory retreat arose at the bottom of the ravine where they had last halted. It was doubtless after a hard struggle that Hatteras had decided to discontinue his journey. So much effort and fatigue thrown away. A useless trip, entailing the death of one of his men. To return without a scrap of coal, what would the crew say? What might it not do under the lead of Shandon? But Hatteras could not continue the struggle any longer. He gave all his attention to their preparations for returning. The sledge was repaired. Its load, too, had become much lighter, and only weighed 200 pounds. They mended their worn-out, torn clothes, all soaked through and through by the snow. New moccasins and snowshoes replaced those which were no longer serviceable. This kept them busy the whole of the 29th and the morning of the 30th. Then they all sought what rest they could get, and prepared for what was before them. During the 36 hours spent in or near the snow house, the doctor had been noticing Duke, whose singular behavior did not seem to him to be natural. The dog kept going in circles which seemed to have a common center. There was a sort of elevation in the soil, produced by accumulated layers of ice. Duke, as he ran around this place, kept barking gently and wagging his tail impatiently, looking at his master as if asking something. The doctor, after reflecting a moment, ascribed this uneasiness to the presence of Simpson's corpse, which his companions had not yet had time to bury. Hence he resolved to proceed to this sad ceremony on that very day. The next morning they were to start. Bell and the doctor, picks in hand, went to the bottom of the ravine. The elevation which Duke had noticed offered a suitable place for the grave, which would have to be dug deep to escape the bears. The doctor and Bell began by removing the soft snow. Then they attacked the solid ice. At the third blow of his pick the doctor struck against some hard body. He picked up the pieces and found them the fragments of a glass bottle. Bell brought to light a stiffened bag, in which were a few crumbs of fresh biscuit. "What's this?" said the doctor. "What can it be?" asked Bell, stopping his work. The doctor called to Hatteras, who came at once. Duke barked violently, and with his paws tried to tear up the ice. "Have we by any possibility come across a supply of provisions?" said the doctor. "It looks like it," answered Bell. "Go on," said Hatteras. "A few bits of food were found and a box quarter full of pemmican." "If we have," said Hatteras, "the bears have visited it before we did. See, these provisions have been touched already." "It is to be feared," answered the doctor, "for—" He did not finish his sentence. A cry from Bell interrupted him. He had turned over a tolerably large piece of ice and showed a stiff, frozen human leg in the ice. "A corpse!" cried the doctor. "It's a grave," said Hatteras. It was the body of a sailor about 30 years old, in a perfect state of preservation. He wore the usual dress of Arctic sailors. The doctor could not say how long he had been dead. After this, Bell found another corpse, that of a man of 50, exhibiting traces of the sufferings that had killed him. "They were never buried," cried the doctor. "These poor men were surprised by death as we find them." "You are right, doctor," said Bell. Go on," said Hatteras. Bell hardly dared. Who could say how many corpses lay hidden here? "They were the victims of just such an accident as we nearly perished by," said the doctor. "Their snow house fell in. Let us see if one may not be breathing yet." The place was rapidly cleared away, and Bell brought up a third body, that of a man of 40. He looked less like a corpse than the others. The doctor bent over him and thought he saw some signs of life. "He's alive!" he shouted. Bell and he carried this body into the snow house, while Hatteras stood in silence, gazing at the sunken dwelling. The doctor stripped the body. It bore no signs of injury. With Bell's aid he rubbed it vigorously with tow dipped in alcohol, and he saw life gradually reviving within it, but the man was in a state of complete prostration, and unable to speak. His tongue clove to his palate as if it were frozen. The doctor examined his patient's pockets. They were empty. No paper. He let Bell continue rubbing, and went out to Hatteras. He found him in the ruined snow house, clearing away the floor. Soon he came out, bearing a half-burned piece of an envelope. A few words could be deciphered: Taimont, Orpoise, W. York. "Altamont," shouted the doctor, "of the Porpoise." "Of New York." "An American," said Hatteras. "I shall save him," said the doctor. "I'll answer for it, and we shall find out the explanation of this puzzle." He returned to Altamont, while Hatteras remained pensive. The doctor succeeded in recalling the unfortunate man to life, but not to consciousness. He neither saw, heard, nor spoke, but at any rate he was alive. The next morning Hatteras said to the doctor, "We must start." "All right, Hatteras. The sledge is not loaded. We shall carry this poor fellow back to the ship with us." "Very well," said Hatteras. "But first let us bury these corpses." The two unknown sailors were placed beneath the ruins of the snow house. Simpson's body took the place of Altamont's. The three travelers uttered a short prayer over their companion, and at 7 o'clock in the morning they set off again for the ship. 2 of the dogs were dead. Duke volunteered to drag the sledge, and he worked as resolutely as a Greenland dog. For 20 days, from January 31st to February 19th, the return was very much like the first part of the journey. Save that it was in the month of February, the coldest of the whole year, and the ice was harder. The travelers suffered terribly from the cold, but not from the wind or snowstorm. The sun reappeared for the first time January 31st. Every day it rose higher above the horizon. Bell and the doctor were at the end of their strength, almost blind and quite lame. The carpenter could not walk without crutches. Altamont was alive, but continued insensible. Sometimes his life was despaired of, but unremitting care kept him alive. And yet the doctor needed to take the greatest care of himself, for his health was beginning to suffer. Hatteras thought of the Forward. In what condition was he going to find it? What had happened on board? Had Johnson been able to withstand Shandon and his allies? The cold had been terrible. Had they burned the ship? Had they spared her masts and keel? While thinking of this, Hatteras walked on as if he had wished to get an early view of the Forward. February 24th, in the morning, he stopped suddenly. 300 paces before him appeared a reddish glow, above which rose an immense column of black smoke, which was lost in the grey clouds of the sky. "See that smoke?" he shouted. His heart beat as if it would burst. "See that smoke?" he said to his companions. "My ship is on fire." "But we are more than 3 miles from it," said Bell. "It can't be the Forward." "Yes, but it is," answered the doctor. "The mirage makes it seem nearer." "Let us run," cried Hatteras. They left the sledge in charge of Duke and hastened after the captain. An hour later they came in sight of the ship. A terrible sight! The brig was burning in the midst of the ice, which was melting about her. The flames were lapping her hull, and the southerly breeze brought to Hatteras's ears unaccustomed sounds. 500 feet from the ship stood a man raising his hands in despair. He stood there, powerless, facing the fire which was destroying the Forward. The man was alone. It was Johnson. Hatteras ran towards him. "My ship! My ship!" he cried. "You!" "Captain," answered Johnson, "you!" "Stop!" "Not a step farther." "Well?" asked Hatteras with a terrible air. "The wretches," answered Johnson, "they've been gone 48 hours, after firing the ship." "Curse them!" groaned Hatteras. Then a terrible explosion was heard, the earth trembled, the icebergs fell, a column of smoke rose to the clouds, and the Forward disappeared in an abyss of fire. At that moment the doctor and Bell came up to Hatteras. He roused himself suddenly from his despair. "My friends," he said energetically, "the cowards have taken flight. The brave will succeed. Johnson, Bell, you are bold. Doctor, you are wise. As for me, I have faith. There is the North Pole. Come, to work." Hatteras's companions felt their hearts glow at these brave words. And yet the situation was terrible for these four men and the dying man, abandoned without supplies, alone at the 84th degree of latitude, in the very heart of the polar regions. End of Book 1.